Okay, good evening, everybody. Sego ni buju endio wachea kwekwe. As the mayor of the city of Kingston, I offer these words in the spirit of this gathering. Let us bring our good minds and hearts together as one to honor and celebrate these traditional lands as a gathering place of the original peoples and their ancestors who were entrusted to care for Mother Earth since time immemorial. It is with deep humility that we offer our gratitude for their contributions to this community, having respect for all as we share this space now and walk side by side into the future. So with that, we will officially call to order. Madam Deputy Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Yes, Mayor Patterson, we have quorum. At this time, I can confirm that all members of council are here with the exception of Councillor Stroud. Joining us from staff, we have CAO Lanny Hurdle, Paige Agnew, Commissioner of Community Services, Peter Hugenboss, Commissioner of Business, Environment and Projects, Brad Joyce, Commissioner of Corporate Services, Sheila Kidd, Commissioner of Transportation and Public Works, Desiree Kennedy, CFO and City Treasurer, John Bolognone, City Clerk, Jennifer Campbell, Director of Heritage Services, Brody Richmond from Environment Department, Alan McLeod, Acting Director of Legal Services and City Solicitor, Ruth Nordegraff, Director of Housing and Social Services, Tim Park, Director of Planning Services, Ian Semple, Director of Transportation Services, Lucretia Turner, Director of Recreation and Leisure Services, excuse me, Cheryl Hitchin, Social Policy Strategic Communications Development Manager, Marissa Mascaro, Manager of Transportation Infrastructure, Jeff Walker, Manager of Taxation and Revenue, Matt Cousin from Transportation, and myself, Janet Janes, Deputy City Clerk, and Ian Sullivan is our meeting host tonight. We do have a number of delegations on the agenda tonight from Kathy Borowick and Jacqueline Collier from Habitat for Humanity. We will have, there's a few more on the addendum, bear with me please. We have a delegation from Don Timperman regarding a heritage matter. We also have delegations from Leslie Dalson and Matthew Holmes from Queens, from Pamela Cornell regarding the small, Tiny Homes Micro Living Spaces pilot project with Habitat for Humanity. And I would note that our last delegation, we have received an email from Nathan Rosebeer that he wishes to withdraw his delegation. So although he's listed on the addendum, he won't be present tonight. And we also have a briefing from Dr. Ken Reimer and Dr. Tasman Liang regarding the Kingston Inner Harbor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we were just meeting in Committee of the Whole closed meeting. We did discuss one item with respect to proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality or local board on King Street property. So I will ask for a motion to rise without reporting, please.
Moved by Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor Neal, that Council rise from the Committee of the Whole closed meeting without reporting.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Next, we have the approval of the addeds. There are two sets of addeds that have several delegations. We have a report from Planning Committee. We have a motion of congratulations and then some other communications. Can I have a mover and a seconder for the addeds, please? Moved by Deputy Mayor Neal, seconded by Councillor Kiley. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Are there any disclosures of potential pecuniary interest? Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. I'm Mayor Rita Holland of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston. Declare my pecuniary interest in the matter of clauses 21-169 and 21-177, report number 65, as I am employed by Queen's University.
Okay, thank you very much. Seeing no other disclosures, we will continue on. We have no presentations this evening, but we do have several delegations. So our first delegation is Kathy Borowick, Chief Executive Officer of Habitat for Humanity, and Jacqueline Collier, Head Chair of the Board of Directors for Habitat for Humanity, will be present and speak to Clause 2 of Report number 65 received from the CAO with respect to Tiny Homes Micro Living Spaces pilot project Habitat for Humanity. Just a reminder to all of our delegations that you have 5 minutes to speak, and then at that point, we will open it up for questions from council. Ms. Sporwick, Ms. Collier, if you are there.
We are here.
You're here. All right. Very good. Thank you. Welcome. And you have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, good evening, everyone. Mayor Patterson, members of council, on behalf of Habitat for Humanity, Kingston Limestone Region, and our board of directors, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening and the possibility of furthering our partnership with the City of Kingston through the creation of this tiny home pilot project and potential further development. As some of you may know, Habitat partners with families and individuals in need of a hand up to build a place they can call home. Stable housing has a tremendous impact on family and community health, improved education outcomes for children, and increased financial stability and opportunity. The cascading effects are far-reaching, and they are transformational. Housing is simply foundational to building strong communities, and the work Habitat does helps to drive critical social and economic outcomes. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Borowak, our CEO, to carry on and explain a little more about Habitat and what this partnership means to Habitat and our community.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Thank you, Jackie. Typically, Habitat for Humanity's niche is homeownership. With the help of volunteers, donors, and Habitat homeowners, Habitat builds affordable homes from single-family houses to multi-unit developments. We don't give away free homes. People pay for their shelter. With homeownership, Habitat holds a mortgage made affordable through payments geared to the household's income, and the future owners volunteer 500 hours with us. We remove barriers that can make owning a home impossible for many low-income families and individuals. Our Habitat program is a partnership where the beneficiaries actively participate in building a better home and future for themselves and their families. Successful applicants demonstrate their need for better housing, a need to move from poorly maintained, unhealthy, or overcrowded housing, unaffordable rent, or inaccessible housing for people living with disabilities. They demonstrate a willingness to partner with Habitat. Habitat home buyers volunteer a minimum of 500 hours spent building their own home, the home of someone else, or at our Habitat Restore. They also demonstrate the ability to make affordable mortgage payments. Habitat homes are sold at fair market value with mortgage payments back to Habitat that are set at the standard affordability measure of 30% of gross household income. To be successful, applicants have to have sufficient income to pay for the home over time and absorb the inherent costs involved in owning and maintaining their home. Habitat Kingston Limestone Region is thankful for the previous, present, and future partnership opportunities with the City of Kingston. At different times in our history, support has come in the way of covering development charges, the donation of land on which to build Habitat housing, planting trees, support for energy efficiency in our upcoming build through the Climate Action Fund, and general goodwill and cooperation with various city departments. Presently, we receive benefit through the Homeownership Down Payment Assistance Program. We very recently broke ground on land given to Habitat for the construction of 4 townhomes, adding much needed affordable housing stock to the area. And we appreciate that planning and engineering fees for affordable housing providers have been waived. All of this helps us do what we do. In the fall of 2019, at a meeting to discuss a pilot project of tiny homes, Habitat expressed interest in being involved. We see a way to adapt our program to respond to a growing need for more and different forms of housing. To review local statistics briefly, of the 70,000 households in Kingston, 14% or approximately 10,000 live in core housing need. That is housing that is unaffordable and or unsuitable and or inadequate. The majority of those households are renting. The environment is shifting around us and everyone is looking again at sustainability and how best to meet the needs of our communities. For the first time in recorded Canadian history, A one-person household is the most common household type. An individual or a small family could reside in these tiny homes or micro living units, providing a more affordable way to live for people with low incomes. There is good reason for us to undertake this exciting and innovative project. Habitat's strategic goals include forging strong community partnerships and to identify and help meet the housing needs in our community. And we see an opportunity to lend our experience in home building and affordable housing project to this project. At Habitat, we believe everyone has a right to the safe and decent place to live, and that it benefits all of society when they do. We thank you for your time and consideration of this new venture together.
Very much. Are there any questions from council? Deputy Mayor Neal.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the good work that you've done in the past. I'm a little curious. Tiny homes can sometimes be a bit of a misnomer. I've received a question from a constituent, which I couldn't answer, but I'm sure you can. His concern was that, are we putting people in closets? How many square feet do you anticipate the tiny homes that you're proposing will have? If you could answer that, that would be great. Sure.
We're talking about 350 to 500 square feet. If the one accessible unit that we plan, and there may be others that are built to universal, that size may grow. We don't have a firm plan yet. And certainly living in a tiny home won't be for everybody. It is designed to be very efficient living space, and possibly, maybe it's a stepping stone to enter the market and move on from there.
I appreciate that. That's the equivalent of a micro apartment, or the equivalent of a small or a living space. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Next is Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. So the first question is, do you have other similar projects that resemble the model that's proposed of that's not exactly home ownership, it's a rental situation? And one thing in particular that I'm interested in knowing is whether or not that the volunteer component of the relationship that you described with Habitat, how that would work in the model that's being proposed this evening.
We don't have a set plan at this point for that. It is an important element of our program, and we will try to fit it in. There are other habitats who are working simultaneously right along with us, and we are in contact with each other. There's a project in Windsor, for example, another project in Sarnia, or Sarnia-Lambton, that area. And we are talking with those folks so that we share the learning that we have. And of course, there are multiple projects in the US. And if Habitat does one thing well, it's share information.
Thank you. Okay, and then my next question is and I guess if you want to elaborate with an example similar to what you just, the ones you just mentioned, that's great. And if that information is not available, I totally understand. But I am wondering about the sort of potential situation or relationship with the city when it comes to property standards with a tiny home development that is a rental situation.
Right. One of the ways that we can work in volunteering, we've talked about this, is to have the residents participate in the care and maintenance of the whole property. And their unit would be included in that, the surrounding area of their unit. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it does sound somewhat similar to a condo type model, I suppose, the way you describe it. Interesting. I think there's potential there. Thanks for the information.
Arsenic.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you very much for the presentation. Very excited to see tiny homes being built in Kingston. I just have a question. We know that there's going to be 6 homes, and when you were talking about applicants, do you already have a list of applicants, or how are you going to get the applicants? How does somebody know to apply to be an applicant if you don't already have a list going? How does that work?
The plan is to work with city housing staff to try to help move people off the waiting list that is ever growing there. So we will vet the applicants in a similar fashion to our home ownership program, but it will be adapted to fit.
Okay, thank you. And for the similar projects that are undergoing in Windsor and Sarnia, Lambton, is the $80,000 per unit, is that similar in Sarnia and London?
It is. Those folks are actually we all are looking at prefab models or modular units. I don't think we will go modular. We have a different plan, but we have also had a preliminary conversation with St. Lawrence College and their skills program there.
Interesting. All right. Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your efforts, especially in the insufficient government funding for housing in these days. This is a question from a constituent, and I said I would ask it. Is it, and don't take it from me, okay? It's not from me. Is it possible to propose more attractive and more personalized structures than Habitat is proposing? It could go a long way to attracting enthusiastic donors and volunteers.
We will do our best. We don't have, like I say, we don't have a design. We will make them as attractive as we are able, and functional at the same time and durable.
So it's a question of budget then.
It is, and yes and no. Efficiency is important. The design, we hope, will be an attractive design. We don't have that in place yet.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see, any other questions from council? So Ms. Borwick, Ms. Colley, thank you very much. And that we will move on to our second delegation this evening. We will invite Dawn Timperin to appear before council to speak to clause 1, subsection 1 of report number 66 received from Heritage Kingston with respect to the approval of application for Ontario Heritage Act approval 1403 Highway 15. Mr. Timperin, welcome, and you have the floor.
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Good evening, Mayor Patterson and councillors. This is reference committee report 66 from Heritage Kingston, item approval of application for Ontario Heritage Act approval 1403 Highway 15. That is our address of my wife Zoe and I. Our subject is approval of the garage building permit with staff generated conditions, but without the 8th condition added by Heritage Kingston Committee. Our objective is to proceed with the garage using high quality architectural vertical board and batten vinyl siding. The material issue here is not about the expense, although as I'm certain councillors are aware, the price of wood projects has increased this last year due to supply and demand. For us, the issue is time spent in maintenance. We spend a considerable amount of time repairing and maintaining our heritage designated brick, stone, and wood home. The proposed garage will not be a heritage building until it ages as much as the house has. So we don't believe that it should be treated as a heritage building in the same way as the main building. That said, we know and understand that the garage should not detract from the heritage building. We want to use high quality architectural vertical board and batten vinyl siding. There is a lot of it around and it looks very good. Vinyl is not the same as it used to be, so all vinyl should not be labeled with the same stamp. Using high quality architectural vertical board and batten vinyl siding will last decades, require minimal maintenance by us, and from the road, which is over 20 meters away, it will appear equally as attractive as wood, board, and batten. Indeed, at that distance, it will be very difficult to discern any difference. We agree essentially with the city planning staff, 7 mandated conditions, with the exception of the 8th condition added by Heritage Kingston Committee, dealing with the type of material that must be used. We've heard that Heritage Kingston Committee conditions have rarely been overturned. While we appreciate supporting staff decisions, the Heritage Kingston Committee condition is entirely subjective and requires a little objective overrule. As you are aware, 2 southern pests have begun to surface in Ontario, termites and carpenter ants. Both of these pests like to eat and destroy wood products. Cost of those repairs have not been factored into the cost of the materials equation. So we request that you consider our application, including the staff stipulated conditions, while omitting the 8th condition restricting high quality architectural vertical board and batten vinyl siding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from council? Councillor Bull.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's for you. I just wanted to ask Mr. Kipperon, so if this was overturned, it would have significant cost savings. You mentioned that. How unfeasible would the project become if this wasn't overturned? Would it become something where it became a significant financial burden over the years and possibly put the entire project in doubt?
It wouldn't become impossible from a financial point of view. It's the maintenance that is the issue.
Okay, thank you for that. So that would be dollars that would then be, in a sense, taken away from the maintenance of your existing heritage property.
In terms of the cost, it's about 3 times the cost. In dollars, I can give you a quotation. Architectural board and batten vinyl siding at present day costs are $2 per square foot. And so for that garage, it would be about $2,800 plus trims and corners and starters. For the other suggestions, which the present day costs range between $4 and $4.50 a square foot. So a total of $5,600 to $6,300 direct comparison, plus an inherent 20% waste factor when those boards are cut, increasing the potential cost to about $6,700 to $7,500. And there are additional costs for original caulking and possible annual recaulking. So it's labor intensive as well.
Thank you for that information. Definitely needs to be considered. Thank you.
Okay. Don't see any other questions from council. Mr. Kipperon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we will move to our 3rd delegation. We will invite Leslie Dalsin, Executive Director, Athletics and Recreation from Queen's University, and Matthew Holmes, Director of Government and Institutional Relations for Queen's University, who will appear before council to speak to clause 4 of report number 65 received from the CAO with respect to a request for extension of noise exemption, Queen's University Richards Stadium. Ms. Dalsin, Mr. Holmes, welcome, and you have the floor. You're on mute. So
I'm sorry about that. It's only the 3rd time today, so My apologies. Good evening and thank you, Your Worship, Mayor Patterson, members of council. My name is Leslie Dowsin, the Executive Director of Athletics and Recreation at Queen's University, and I am joined tonight by Matthew Holmes, the Director of Government and Institutional Relations. Council has received our detailed application for a noise bylaw exemption request for Richardson Stadium that covers the remainder of 2021 and the year of 2022. I'd be pleased to respond to any specific questions you may have for us on our request. I would like to remind Council that this is a continuation of a new format for the noise bylaw exemption request, which the City asked us to introduce in 2019. This new format provides Council with a total view of the maximum number of events planned for the year, whether they are Queen's Athletics, for our local community groups, or sport tourism events that may be coming to Kingston. This also saves our local community group partners, the majority of whom are youth sports, the expense of having to apply for multiple individual requests throughout the year. I'm pleased to say that we've had no formal complaints through the 2019 year or in response to this year's request. Queen's did deliver advance notice to our West Campus neighbors near the stadium in June, advising them of our noise bylaw exemption request and seeking comment. The application that Queen's has put forward to the city is for the same terms and conditions as the noise bylaw exemption that was approved last approved by the City Council in 2019. But with two changes: a decreased number of occurrences in 2021 due to the pandemic, and the 2022 year is identical to the requests made for 2019. While the pandemic has certainly created a lot of uncertainty for sport and recreation, and in terms of what activities will be able to resume in the fall, we are optimistic that some sports events will be back. All activities at Richardson Stadium will be done in consultation with public health and in a manner that is safe and in alignment with all COVID-19 protocols. We hope that City Council will continue to see the benefit of the one full application for community-sponsored and Queen's events at Richardson Stadiums provided in this way. My thanks to all of you for your consideration of our request, and I would be pleased to answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions from council? Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. And I just want to mention that I have also not heard from any residents, any concerns, but it is great to hear that you reached out to the neighborhood before submitting the exemptions tonight. Just wonder, when you reached out with people, if you also gave a phone number or contact information, if anybody does have concerns, how they could reach Queen's to discuss any concerns.
Yes, thank you for that question, Councillor Doherty. We did provide in our communication to our neighbors the telephone number for our West Campus hotline, which is immediately responded to by our staff, who go immediately to address any noise complaints with the users of the fields at the time. And we also provided information related to our West Campus website, where we post schedules and other details regarding events that are and communications that are related to the West Campus fields. And thirdly, we also did provide the email address for our community relations newsletter that is sent out periodically by our government relations and our government and institutional relations team.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and through you, thank you, Ms. Delson, for your presentation. And also, I want to recognize what you said in your presentation, that you've changed the format of request to include community groups and your events, and I think that's helpful. And I know that is what we'd asked for last time, so I personally appreciate that that is the route you took. My only concern with it, though, now seeing it in action, is that we don't know the actual dates that are being requested. So do you have any line of sight on that, recognizing that COVID has made everything topsy-turvy, but how do we approve this if we don't know when we're approving for what?
All of our scheduled events do appear on our website. So our West Campus neighbors know what's coming up and are aware of the activities that are going on. I would say this year has been more difficult than in previous years because of the nature of the pandemic. We haven't been able to, typically we know what our schedules are like a year ahead of time, but because of the way the schedules have been unfolding this year and the details that we and the arrangements that we've had to follow, we have been in a situation where it's more of a more uncertain. Right now, we have an understanding of what our league schedules would look like, but we certainly at this point don't have any information from our community groups about what they are planning to do because of the nature of the season and the fact that they're still trying to respond to what is allowable under the provincial framework for reopening.
Totally understandable. Okay, thank you for that answer.
Okay, not seeing any other questions then. Ms. Delsin, Mr. Holmes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with that, we will move to our fourth delegation. So just noting that I'll first need a motion to add our fourth delegation. So moved by Councillor McLaren, seconded by Councillor Hutchison, that clauses 12.9 and 12.11 of our procedural bylaw be waived in order to allow Pamela Cornell to speak to clause 2, report number 65 from the CAO with respect to the Tiny Homes for Living Spaces pilot project for Habitat for Humanity. So we will call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, so with that, Ms. Cornell, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm really excited about the Tiny Homes project that's in the works now. We've been waiting for it to come to council. But I think the key to success in a venture like this is community involvement, and that hasn't happened yet. With dramatic evidence of the climate crisis all around us, we need to ensure that these little houses reflect the best expertise that can be brought to bear on their design. Provision should be made for groups like 350.org to contribute their knowledge of materials and infrastructure, along with perhaps their volunteer building efforts. In Detroit's Cass Tiny Homes community, each house has its own solar panel to supplement the electricity supply. In contrast to houses with indoor acreage, a goal of tiny homes is to decrease the builder's carbon footprint while also helping occupants reduce their own energy demands and cost of living. By 2030, the Government of Canada is aiming to require, in its building code, net zero buildings that will use only as much energy as they can produce from renewable sources. Given the state of our climate, there's no sense postponing smart design and building decisions that can be made now. And then there are the people for whom these little houses are intended. We all have our insecurities, and for some of us, that means needing a buffer zone around us. Encounters in corridors, elevators, and stairwells can be anxiety-inducing, as can other people's sounds and cooking smells. A little house with no shared walls can provide a sense of safety and security. A front porch or a back deck can serve to expand the limited indoor space, and the surrounding lot can provide the comforting activity of growing flowers and vegetables. Ideally, no two of these houses should look the same. They should reflect the fact that each is occupied by a unique individual. If there are to be 8 houses, and that's what up to 8 houses, I guess, there should be more than 2 or 3 designs, and none should be attached to the others. Of course, this will cost money, most of which will have to be raised in the community, though a series of Trillium grants might also be a possibility. Dawn House qualified for all 3 of the Trillium grants: Seed, Capital, and Grow. And let's hope this project does too. A successful fundraising campaign will depend on a visually appealing plan combined with compelling stories of the transformative effect these tiny homes could have, not just on the lives of their occupants, but also on the supportive community that has been built around them. Raising enough cash, in-kind contributions, and volunteer labor to entirely cover the cost of each house would eliminate the need for a mortgage. Monthly rental fees would pay for water, electricity, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs. A condition of occupancy might be committing to attend monthly classes at the North Kingston Community Centre, where volunteers could offer guidance on cleaning products and processes, preventive maintenance, seasonal upkeep requirements, and handy person skills. During those classes, which could be open to any interested members of the public, instructors could offer suggestions about organizing books, dishes, kitchen utensils, and clothing. Class discussions could focus on how to streamline a closet and craft storage cubbies under beds, on top of walls, inside footstools, and on shelves. A tiny home is no place for a hoarder. In conclusion, I hope you will ask constructive questions this evening and continue to monitor this worthy project carefully as it progresses through its various stages. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for the delegation? Deputy Mayor Neal.
Hello, Pamela, and thank you for your presentation. Are you aware that, and we did have, I believe, a public meeting around it, but our comprehensive zoning bylaw and official plan review is going on, and there's one of the proposals is to make tiny homes a by right addition to people's property. Have you had an opportunity to look at that? And if not, just send planning an email.
Jim, I'm sorry, my screen froze and I didn't hear your question.
Okay, sorry. I'll make it shorter. I'm the master of long questions. Our comprehensive zoning bylaw is going through the process right now, and it's already had a draft presentation looking at tiny homes being made available by right, and some of the discussion of how to build or what qualifies as a tiny home is also part of that. If you haven't yet seen the draft, that would be great if you have an opportunity to.
Okay. I read the report on tiny homes, but I haven't read that, I don't think.
Okay. Yeah, if you touch base with our planners, they'll make sure you get invited anytime it's on the agenda.
Okay. It's just that these are setting a precedent and in a way, so they're a kind of prototype. These tiny homes could be a prototype for others to, so if they're setting an example, it'd be good if they were exemplary.
I agree. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Mr. Chappelle.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just wondering if Pamela, thank you very much for your presentation. It's always good to hear your remarks. My question is, are you aware of a tiny home builder who's local? Ferris Design. It's in the complex behind Graphite.
No, I'm not.
They're a local company that actually have a demonstration model that's up in the community in a backyard, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And maybe this is an opportunity for us to support local business.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from council? Okay, seeing none. Ms. Cornell, thank you very much. And with that, that brings us to the end of our delegations. So moving on, next in our agenda, we do have one briefing. So at our June 22nd council meeting, council passed a motion inviting the original authors and researchers involved in the report and research into contaminants in the Inner Harbor to come and to speak to council to give us a little bit more of the context on that work. And so at this point, I will invite Dr. Ken Reimer, Professor Emeritus at Royal Military College, and Dr. Tamsin Lang, Biology Professor from Royal Military College, to brief council on the application of the Canada-Ontario decision-making framework for contaminated sediments in Kingston Inner Harbor report. Dr. Reimer, Dr. Lang, welcome, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be presenting before council again. Thank
Pam,
you.
why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor and councillors, for the opportunity to give a briefing today. The presentation summarizes results from a decade of study that we undertook on the Kingston Inner Harbour, which culminated in a large report produced in 2014, and which is now publicly available. And we'd like to clarify that we are not speaking on behalf of the federal property owners for the Kingston Inner Harbour, and that the proposed sediment management plan that came to council in the April 6th briefing is based on recent studies and not our 2014 report. However, it does appear that the federal property owners and their consultants have come to similar conclusions that we did about the Kingston Inner Harbour. And we're here today to provide some context on the studies carried out in the Kingston Inner Harbour prior to 2014, and to respond to questions based on our professional expertise and our knowledge of the Kingston Inner Harbour sediment contamination. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about our credentials. My expertise is in sediment management. I've been working on sediments now for 30 years. I've led projects on aquatic contaminated sites across Canada. And I have expertise in sediment management as well as ecological risk assessment. And I'm one of the primary authors on the 2014 ESG RMC report on the Kingston Inner Harbour.
I'm Ken Reimer. I'm the Professor Emeritus and Founding Director of the Environmental Sciences Group at RMC. And in that capacity, I led, well, several hundred projects, environmental projects across Canada, and I coordinated that 10-year project that Tam just spoke about. The projects ESG undertook were large and small. The largest was as a scientific authority for DuLine cleanup, the cleanup of Cold War radar sites in the Arctic. And that was the first major Arctic cleanup, and ESG developed the standards for that project. More recently, as a semi-retired consultant, I was the chair of the Independent Expert Advisory Committee for the Muskrat Falls project, looking into how methyl mercury might impact the country foods so sought by Indigenous peoples in Labrador. Over to you, Tam.
Okay, next slide, please. So this is an overview of the Kingston Inner Harbour, which many people are familiar with. Just to orient people, there's a LaSalle Causeway down at the bottom and the Bell Park landfill in the center with Bell Island. And as most residents are familiar, there are a number of historical industries that operated down the western side of the harbour, from the Bell Park landfill to the Davis Tannery to the coal gasification plant. Next slide, please. And these have led to a legacy of contamination within the sediments. What I'm going to show over the next few slides is a few maps showing the contaminant concentrations in the sediments. Again, we have the LaSalle Causeway down at the bottom and Bell Island in the center of this map. And the color coding shows the concentrations, with the yellow, orange, and red being progressively the higher concentrations of these contaminants. As they get into the yellow color, it exceeds an environmental quality guideline known as the probable effects level, which is indicative of potential effects to the aquatic ecosystem. And so here's an example of one of the contaminants, zinc, which you can see has elevated concentrations close to Bell Park and Douglas Fleury Park. Next slide, please. This is arsenic, which is elevated in the sediments very close to the rowing club and the woolen mill. Next slide, please. Mercury, which is more widespread in a similar area down around Douglas Fleury Park as well. Next slide, please. Lead, which not surprisingly, given that there is a lead smelter here, there's quite a bit of lead in the sediments with high concentrations around Douglas Fleury Park and the corner south of Bell Park landfill next to the Davis Tannery. Next slide, please. PCBs, which are a contaminant which may biomagnify to high concentrations in the upper levels of the aquatic food web. And these are found, the highest concentrations are found south of Bell Park. Next slide, please. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are associated with contaminants such as coal tar, which are found at high concentrations in Anglin Bay and along the Bell Park landfill. Next slide, please. And chromium, which is present in very high abundances and widespread, which would have come from the former Davis Tannery. So a big mixture, complex mixture of contaminants, and as you can see, mostly down the western shoreline side of the Kingston Inner Harbor. Next slide, please. One perception is that these contaminants are safely tied up in a paste, and our studies showed that that's not generally the case. There are processes that can mobilize these sediments. Kingston Inner Harbor is very shallow. It's about 1 meter depth, deep throughout. And because of those shallow water depths, boat propellers, ice, wave action, and fish such as carp, which you can see a picture down at the bottom, when they feed, can stir up the sediments and resuspend them. We also looked at burial rates with clean sediments through sediment coring studies, and there's very slow burial with clean sediments in some areas of the harbor as well. And the contaminants in the sediments are taken up into the aquatic food web. So there's 30 years of studies showing that in animals and plants, organisms in the more heavily contaminated areas of the harbor take up contaminants at a higher level than fish and animals living in less contaminated areas. Next slide, please. And those contaminants can cause effects. So these are pictures of brown bullhead, which are a type of fish that lives closely associated with the sediment. They actually bury themselves in the sediment for part of the year. These are fish that we caught in the area south of Bell Park, and they had a higher frequency of external lesions and tumors than fish that we caught up near the 401 in the more the cleaner area of the harbor. So for example, the upper right is an example of an epidermal lesion. Next slide, please. There are a number of human health and ecological risks of this sediment contamination. Our study looked at thousands of sediment analyses. We looked at hundreds of tissue samples from 15 different types of biota and dozens of toxicity tests. And some of the evidence for the ecological effects, when you take sediments from some of the areas of the harbor and you expose organisms that live in these sediments, for example, the aquatic larvae that you see at the upper right, then those organisms either die or they grow or reproduce to a lesser extent than they would in cleaner areas of the harbor. And so there's some direct evidence for sediment toxicity, as well as the effects that we saw on fish. We also used established frameworks through Environment Canada and Health Canada to look at effects to human health, as well as organisms that were eating contaminated food items from the harbor. And we do see risks to birds and mammals in the most contaminated areas of the harbor. And for human health, for the area, particularly along the western shoreline, there are potential human health risks from repeated exposure through skin contact with those sediments. And for people that fish within the harbor, they should be aware that there are fish consumption advisories currently in place. They are species specific, and you can find those at the Guide to Eating Ontario Fish. They limit the number of meals that should be eaten per month to be safe because of the levels of contaminants in the fish. Next slide, please. So these risks are generally not spread across the harbor. Many of these would be associated with the contaminated sediments along the western shoreline and the area south of Bell Park. That's the area that poses greatest risk. Next slide, please. One question that might be asked is, can we let these sediments recover on their own? It's called monitored natural recovery, and it can be a strategy that's used at a lot of aquatic contaminated sites. And from the April 6th City Council backgrounder, this has been proposed for most of the harbor area from the federal property owners. We also looked at this as part of our study. We have recommended this on other aquatic contaminated sites we've worked on. Well, what we found in the Kingston Inner Harbor is it wouldn't be effective in areas along the western shoreline where the contaminants concentrations are high and burial with the clean sediments occurs very slowly. So people should be aware that if a cleanup does not take place, then the high concentrations of contaminants in the sediments near the western shoreline and area south of Bell Park will remain, and they are a main source of human health and ecological risk. With that, I'll turn over to Ken to talk about the next slide.
Yes, thank you. Certainly in our report, we recommended that dredging be one, not the only one, but one of the principal means of remediating these contaminated sediments. And we made that recommendation because it is a standard remediation technique that's used at many aquatic contaminated sites, both in North America and around the world, including in river environments. Now, you might think that disturbing the sediments by removing the material, you might cause more harm, but there are controls that are put in place to take care of that. For one thing, suction dredges are used, or like a vacuum cleaner, to suck up these contaminated sediments and transport them to a safer location away from the harbor. You can see here in the middle picture an example of an engineering control where the work area is on the right. You can see quite a lot of turbidity, and clear waters on the other side. So these are used to isolate the work area from the rest of the water body while that work is taking place. And furthermore, there are monitoring that's conducted in the water outside that barrier to make sure that the water quality remains at the level that is chosen to be protective of the environment moving forward. We do know that the contaminants, although they're available to organisms, are mainly attached to the sediment particles. So if you look at the bottom screen, you can see these little brown particles made to represent the sediment particles with contaminants attached. And the contaminants are not dissolved into the pore water, little bits of water that are amounts of mud in the sediment. So capturing the suspended sediments and then sucking them away or taking them away using a dredge is a way to remove the contaminants from the work area. Next slide, please. So this tells us that sediment remediation can be done in the KIH safely without catastrophic impacts. Next slide, please. We know this because there are many examples of successful projects. Perhaps one of the largest in North America is the Hudson River project. Historically, General Electric casually dumped transformer fluids containing PCBs into the river. And when the impact of these contaminants were discovered in the 1980s, it was also recognized that there was no technology that could safely deal with the contaminated sediments, even though they were having a significant effect. In about 20 years, advances in technology caused the US Environmental Protection Agency to move forward with a remediation plan. And that remediation was mainly dredging, supported by capping. That's to cover the sediments with material to prevent the contaminants being taken up into the ecosystem, and also burial with clean sediments. And they were very careful. They did the project in 2 phases because this was a learning experience. This is one of the first really large projects that was conducted. And phase 1 results were applied to phase 2. And phase 2 was extremely successful. Over a 6-year period, an enormous amount of contaminated sediment was successfully removed from a 40-mile section of the river. Next slide, please. Now, I'm very familiar with this project because I was involved very early on with it. And I chaired 2 independent peer review committees for the Hudson River project. A peer review committee in the United States is quite interesting. It's quite unique in when 2 parties, the General Electric on one side and the EPA on the other, may not agree on various issues. An independent group of scientists are brought together to try to address these key questions. The first panel I chaired was to look at whether remediation was necessary. GE proposed that burial would take care of everything, and EPA thought not. Our committee found for EPA, we determined that the impact was significant and that in many sections of the river, burial would not be possible and remediation was essential. A second committee that I chaired was to develop the performance standards to ensure the success of the project. And these are the standards that look into what do the monitoring data have to show outside those barriers? How do we make sure that the project is doing its job and not having leaks, if you like, of the contaminated material outside of the immediate work area? Now, I didn't chair it, but there was another quality life standards committee, and that was to ensure that impacts due to noise, lights, economic issues, et cetera, were dealt with. So in other words, there can be standards developed and should be developed for any project of this type to ensure its success and minimize any kind of negative effect of the actual work itself. And there are many, many other examples of successful projects. Here in Canada, Rock Bay in Victoria, BC, it's located in the downtown core and within traditional territories of First Nations. And it held some of the most contaminated sediments in Victoria Harbour. In order to minimize the impact on wildlife, some 3,000 fish and aquatic wildlife were relocated to allow the dredging to take place safely. Next slide, please. So it is important to address community concerns, and we welcome the fact that the public has become concerned about this issue. It's important that their concerns be brought forward to the federal owners before detailed design takes place. And all sediment management projects of this type must undergo a detailed impact assessment to look at those concerns and implement measures to address them. They need to minimize any negative social and economic impacts. The activities need to be planned to avoid impacts to wildlife. And it has to be assured that the remediation work does not cause environmental harm. So this impact assessment has to be conducted and address these concerns in order to make sure that it's going to be successful, and we believe it can be. Next slide, please. So sediment remediation, in our view, in the Kingston Inner Harbor can be done safely. The public needs to have those questions answered, and then project proponents need to answer them correctly and put those safeguards in place. But there are many examples to say that this can be done, and it will result in a healthier river ecosystem and decreased human health risks. Next slide, please. So if you want more information, we did provide an addendum to May 18th council meeting, and our report is now fully available through the City of Kingston at the address that you see here. And we will be pleased to address any of your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions from council? Okay, Councillor McLaren.
Thank you. So we heard from a presenter last time that there could be a catastrophic event, and it sounds like you're confident that we can avoid this with remediation things, with using a vacuum sucker or some sort of cordon off of the water thing. So you're basically telling us that based on your knowledge of this, we can do this safely without, like, we can raise up all this stuff from 150 years of heavy waste, I guess, and not shock the environmental system in a way that could be majorly damaging in the short run for, say, years, as we were told in the last presentation?
We are saying that. We're completely confident because of the examples of many projects that have successfully dealt with similar issues. I can only say that I'm familiar with a number of these, and I've given you a couple of examples, but there are many more that you can research. I think an added piece of information is that, our 2014 report is when we finished our work there and arrived at these conclusions. And in the 7 years since, we know that Transport Canada has done initial work through their consultants. They've come, it appears, from what we saw at the April 6th meeting, where the areas are targeted for remediation, that they have similar plans. They must have come to similar conclusions. That's a very comforting thing for people in the science area to see that two groups independently arrive at the same conclusion. And furthermore, they would not get funding through the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan unless this work was peer reviewed successfully to say that it is necessary. And our work was also peer reviewed. So that's two separate lines of thought, plus a third line, which is the examples of many successful projects. We can only let that evidence speak for itself.
Thank you. And the second follow-up question, we were, or at least I was, shown this report by a member of the public, and on, as a preface to that report, there is a letter that was signed by 3 people, Dr. Lang, Dr. Kosh, and Dr. Weber. And there is a paragraph there that is concerning, and it claims that as of April 2021, a proposed approach for sediment management has been developed to address risk posed by contaminated sediment in the Kingston Inner Harbor. The proposed sediment management approach is based on the studies undertaken since 2014, and therefore is not, and not is underlined here, contained in this 2014 report. This 2014 report does present some preliminary analysis of management options, but the discussion is now outdated and should be considered to be superseded by the follow-up work done in other areas since. Is it possible for us to get copies of these follow-up reports? And based on that letter, is your recommendation still to dredge?
I can speak to that one because I wrote that letter. And really what I wanted to make clear there was that the federal property owners have undertaken more study, and they have based their plan on the recent studies. But they also appear to have come, as Ken just spoke to very similar conclusions as we came to, including the areas that need to be addressed, and the fact that more active intervention methods are needed here than monitored natural recovery. So we do strongly believe that there's a need for more information on the plan. We understand that they will be coming to provide that information. I still think that given the knowledge and that we have about the Kingston Inner Harbor and the expertise in this field, that we stand by the conclusions of our report, and we feel that they are similar to what we have seen from the federal property owners so far.
And I just like to reemphasize that we're not speaking, of course, on behalf of the federal property owners. We're speaking on behalf of our knowledge of both our knowledge of 10 years of experience on the river, plus knowledge of other projects of this type. This can be done successfully. That's the message I guess we're suggesting. There are questions that need to be answered by the project proponents to ensure that the right performance measures are put in place to ensure that success.
Thank you, and I hope that you help guide us in what those proper performance measures should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I found it very interesting. You mentioned that standards developed that we need to ensure that there are proper standards are developed to ensure a successful project. And you also mentioned third-party reviews. I wonder if you could speak to the importance of process to ensure that this will be a successful project if it does go ahead, and if it would include a third-party review, and what about public engagement? So I wonder if you could, having had experience with successful projects, if you could speak to the actual process.
Why don't you start off, Dan, and I'll follow up.
Sure, sounds great. So on similar sediment management projects, there is a need and a duty to consult with stakeholders, with Indigenous peoples, and with the public. And the concerns that are heard as part of that process go into completion of a detailed impact assessment, along with a review of all of the preliminary plan. So our understanding is what we have so far for the Kingston Inner Harbor is a preliminary plan, and that the federal property owners will be entering into this public engagement portion of it. And then they will take what they hear, as well as the review of the preliminary plan, to complete the detailed impact assessment and then develop a detailed design going forward. Ken, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think that really covers it. There's a next step is what's the important point, and that's where the public's concerns need to be heard. And the federal property owners will have to respond in a way that addresses those concerns in order to still get their funding. I think that's a key part.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that. I do have a couple other questions. So would you think, in your opinion, would a successful cleanup of the Inner Harbor include cleaning up the sites that are still leaching problematic chemicals into the harbor?
You might as well go first, Tam, and I'll follow up again.
Okay, sounds good. So we did look at some of the sources along the harbor, and some of those sources have been addressed quite successfully in that there have been remedial measures put in, and then there's been follow-up sampling and confirmation on behalf of the regulators to be sure that those properties are not still a significant source to the harbor. There are other lands around the harbor that are still a potential ongoing source, and one that comes to mind is the Orchard Marsh, sort of north of the Davis Tannery. That's a little marshy area directly on the north part of that property. We understand, and that will need to be looked at as part of this process. Ken, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, and in our report, we identified the Orchard Marsh and certainly had discussions with the city of Kingston about what kind of activities could take place to try to limit any further impacts from that particular area. So it's identified in our report. I'm sure, well, I haven't seen I haven't read the reports, but I would definitely believe that it will be in the Transport Canada documents as well. So there has to be a plan to deal with those ongoing sources. Again, they wouldn't get the funding if there was an ongoing source into an area that they're trying to clean up. So it's got to go hand in hand.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You're just mentioning ongoing sources. There is still near the orchard wetland, the sewer outflow is there, and the Davis Tannery itself. So will that continue to contribute to the contamination in the river? And will this interfere with achieving a significant cleanup of the inner harbor?
It could if it was not dealt with. But I know we had many discussions when we developed our own report into various ways that could be used to deal with those, both the storm sewer and the orchard marsh. There are quite a number of ways that could be this could be dealt with. So the simple answer is yes, it needs to be done, and there are ways that it can be done. And Tam, I don't know if you want to elaborate.
I think that's, and I know it's been brought to the attention of, as Ken said during our talk about addressing that. It is typical that other sediment management projects have looked at recontamination from sources. I'm sure that it would be looked at. It's a question to bring forward to public consultation when we hear more information from the property owners.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see now. Do you know of any other sources, contamination sources, other than the two I just mentioned? And the ones you did mention, the historical ones, that we should be concerned about, that would undermine, a significant cleanup?
I think those are the major ones, aren't they, Tam? I mean, there's a lot of work the city has done successfully with the Bell Island landfill to contain leachate. That was probably an original source. Davis Tannery, of course, was a huge source during its day. I mean, when you look at satellite or aerial photos of its actual operation, the amount of effluent was tremendous. So they have diminished because of either controls that have been put in place by the city in many cases quite successfully, or just by nature. But the orchard marsh can, especially during high rainfall events, be a continuing source. So yeah, they do need to be dealt with. I think most of them have been identified. I don't think there's anything. I don't think of any surprises, I guess would be my feeling. I should add that when we did our 10-year study, we had formed the Cataract River Stakeholder Group, which include the current property owners, Transport Canada, Parks Canada, the City of Kingston, the regulators, Ministry of the Environment, Environment Canada, Fisheries and Oceans, a number of different stakeholders. So we had input from a lot of the players who have current and previous knowledge of the inner harbor to put that into our thinking. And of course, the current property owners have that information and information they've acquired themselves subsequently.
So would clean fill in itself on the orchard marshland be sufficient to prevent it from recontaminating the river should we manage to clean it up?
Well, it could be capped. What is one method that could be used to contain contamination? I know that it looks very overgrown, but I can add that a part of our study that we did commission a private group with a lot of experience, more than 30 years experience in looking at the biodiversity of similar wetlands. And I believe the conclusion, Tam, was that it was the worst wetland they'd ever seen in 30 years of their history. So yeah, capping it would not be a disaster to the ecosystem. It is not a successful habitat at this moment. The fact that things are growing there doesn't necessarily mean that the diversity is there. It's kind of like chemical contaminants. You don't always know they're having an effect. It's not always visible.
Okay. I take it from that you think can be done. So now there was much mention here earlier in Dr. Lang's presentation that about repeated exposure to contamination. What does that actually entail? Like, what is considered to be repeated?
That's a good question.
Exposure?
And that would be along the shoreline. If there was, perhaps every day or on a recurring basis, coming into contact with the sediments for long periods of time. I would have to ask my colleague, who's the human health risk assessor, the details of the exposure because she completed this work. But we would say to people, the occasional contact I would not be concerned about, but it does have a potential for risk and repeated exposure. And for example, if you had residential developments down there and there were children playing in the sediment as kids often do over time, that could pose a risk.
Right.
And so as we increase access and encourage public use of these areas, these are things that we need to think about in terms of potential contact with those sediments and exposure to them.
Right. So I think this is clear, but I'll just repeat it here. So your conclusions are that the cleanup is necessary because of the nature of the different types of exposure to fish, wildlife, and humans.
Yeah, the contaminated sediments, particularly along the western shoreline and south of Bell Park, have unacceptable or associated with unacceptable human health and ecological risks. And if we address them by removing them, then we allow for those risks to be addressed. And so that's really the main driver for these projects, is that in general, sediment management remediation projects are not undertaken unless the sediments can pose these type of risks. And that is the case here.
And it's the nature of the river in those shallow areas in the western area where the contamination is highest that presents that problem, because it's in shallow water, that sediment is constantly being redisturbed. It's not going to be buried for decades and decades, if at all, and be covered by natural healing. It's going to always be a source and a potential risk. So if we don't remediate it, we'll be stuck with more of the same. If we do, we can look forward to a enriched inner harbor environment.
Okay, another question. Of the methods you've shown us, what's the best way to clean up the tannery hard shoreline, and to clean up the tannery site, especially at the water edge?
Well, there are many different techniques to clean up contaminated sites. We have a lot of experience dealing with land-based contaminated sites as well. I mean, you could remove the material, you can cap the material, you can create barriers between the contamination and the river itself. There are membranes, engineered membranes that do that. So there's a variety of successful techniques that have been used to isolate, and I don't know what's planned for the Davis Tannery per se, but one method could easily be that you make sure that you separate the contamination that's present from the environment around it. And therefore you can use containment measures to do that. And that could include containment measures that would provide barriers to the river itself.
One last question, Mr. Mayor. As you know, there's been quite an effort to rejuvenate the turtle population in the Doug Fleur, Bell Park area. So obviously, well, maybe not obviously, these techniques of flotation and suction and so on, they're invasive of the turtle habitat as it is now. How would that be managed so as to sustain the turtle population?
Sam, do you want to start?
Sure. So that's definitely a question for the federal property owners to ask. Looking at managing projects like this to minimize impacts to turtles or other species at risk is it's important and it's required. And so there will be mitigation measures put into place that are protective of the turtles, and there should be more information forthcoming on that. In terms of shoreline habitat, that can also be incorporated, restoration of habitat following completion of a project. That can be incorporated into the project, or it can be a follow-on community initiative to restore habitat afterwards. Typically what happens during completion of the work activities is that the turtles would be excluded from the work zone and moved to an adjacent suitable habitat in the harbor so that they're not influenced by the work activities that are going on.
Okay, thanks.
I agree. I mean, I mentioned briefly Rock Bay, where they excluded quite a lot of wildlife from the work area. But you've got to remember the dredging is done in sections. So they could choose an area, they have to choose the timing, and they have to choose the area they're going to work in with all those things in mind, and then relocate those animals that need to go to different habitat during that process that takes place. So it depends how they design the sections that they work on, how large those sections are, how quickly they move along. So these are all the right questions to be asking the federal government opponents. But I can say that this has been effective elsewhere. So it's not that it can't be done. It can be done, but it has to be done with these precautions and concerns in mind.
So just to be clear, you have no prior knowledge to the federal studies that follow up your 2014?
No, I can answer that question. I retired from RMC in 2014, and the 10-year report that we produced was I handed that over to all of the members of the Cataract River stakeholder groups with great exhaustion, because I didn't think that anybody was going to do anything about this project, even though we felt it needed to be done. So I was greatly surprised this spring to learn that a project had actually come about. I was dismayed to hear that people thought it couldn't be done and that there was misinformation in that regard, but thrilled to see that something had happened, a decade's worth of work with 7 years of silence. So I'm learning as you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions.
Next is Deputy Mayor Neal.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your report with us. Have you shared that report, I assume, with the federal stakeholders as well? And
yes.
Excellent.
And in 2014, I mentioned there was a fairly large, and I probably haven't included everyone, stakeholder group that had been formed, and they actually were involved on a regular basis with the studies that were being done, the results were being found before the report was even written. The report was also peer reviewed by 3 government departments, Environment Canada, Health Canada, and Fisheries and Oceans. So when we finally completed that report, and I have to admit, I was retiring at the time, and I didn't think I was getting any traction in this project, so I gave the report out and said hasta la vista. So I'm thrilled to be back involved in seeing this any way we can help to make sure these questions are answered correctly.
Excellent. I appreciated your slide deck. Could you make that available to the city as well through the clerks, and we can share that, especially with our EITP. Are you aware that I believe some of the stakeholders have either agreed or hopefully will agree to come to an EITP public meeting? And I look forward to seeing your faces at that Zoom meeting as well. I do have a couple of very quick questions. How long do you anticipate the cleanup project to take before completion?
Well, this is something, of course, that will have to be put to the proponents themselves. I can only speculate. So please, I can give you my best guess or things to consider that you might want to reflect on. There's quite a lot to be done. The detailed impact assessment is essential. That will eventually lead to a final design. So that's where all these questions and hopefully satisfactory answers come into play. And then equipment has to be sorted out and all that. By the time they get onto the river, it depends on how they're going to move through the area and deal with things like turtle habitat, for example. So a number of questions there, but to put it maybe in, my best speculative perspective, in 6 years, they did a 40-mile stretch of river in the Hudson River. We're looking at a much, much smaller area here. So I would anticipate it's not a matter of a single season, because you do need to be respective of those wildlife concerns and so on. So I'm guessing here's my guess. I'll put my nickel on a 3-year program, but I'm speaking only from a guess.
I appreciate that. My last question has to do with how long after that do you think, and I've been asked this by some of the neighbors to the Inner Harbor, when would it be safe for both swimming and aquatic life to be fully open for those?
How would I handle swimming and Tam handles aquatic life? She's a biologist, after all, I'm a chemist. Because the contaminants are attached to the sediment particles, and the important thing to note is that doesn't mean they can't be extracted from the sediment particles by wildlife and plants and such. So that's why they're bioavailable. That's why they get moved up into the food chain. But they don't readily dissolve in the water. So when the sediment particles with contaminants attached are removed, and then there's restoration of the bottom, the water quality should be very good. The water quality is already okay. It just is subject to the fact there's a lot of organic matter that comes into the river, and there's other issues. There's not chemical contaminant issues of that type. So I think that would be swimming would be more readily available soonest, and aquatic life probably a little later. Pam?
Yeah, so it depends on what type of aquatic life we're talking about. So organisms with shorter lifespans, like the small aquatic larvae that live in the sediments, when they're provided with clean sediments, will rebound fairly quickly in general, as long as the other conditions for life are suitable. Organisms that are longer lived, like fish, there is a lag time, and dependent in that the older fish will have a large contaminant burden, but the younger ones will come into an environment that's cleaner, that they don't accumulate the same degree of contaminants.
Thank you. And lastly, I know I had 2 questions, but a third one just popped in mind. Over the years, I'm a retired high school teacher, and I taught in both Gananoque and in Brockville. After the dredging and the cleaning is done, is there a concern that some of our downstream neighbors will be affected at all?
There should be no downstream effects on neighbors, because again, those containment measures to contain those sediment particles will be monitored. They need to be effective. Otherwise, there should be a protocol in place that if for some reason there's an exceedance, work would stop, and then appropriate action would be taken. The key thing is, remember that the contaminants are attached to those sediment particles. They're not dissolving into the water column. If they dissolved in water, it's a different story, although they would then become diluted and wash away. So the downstream neighbors would be receiving a much lesser impact, if you like, but that is not the case. It's the retention of those sediment particles. And you can well imagine that even if, and I really hate to use the word failure, if something failed for a moment, sediment particles aren't going to go all the way downstream. They're going to fall out into the bottom again, somewhere away from the work area. But I have every confidence that the monitoring program should exclude those possibilities, and the containment measures should be effective.
I appreciate that. It's reassuring. Go ahead, Tam.
I'll just follow up by saying I live directly downstream of the Kingston Inner Harbor towards Gananoque. I'm within walking distance of the river, and I'm down there often with my kids and dogs, and I will have no concern about.
We're not keeping you awake.
No.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate the presentation. I actually have an undergrad in biology myself and studied the comparative analysis of Cambarus robustus and the Bronchobodelidae as a commensal living on the exoskeleton on a circumneutral stream and an acidified lake up in Sudbury. So I have some appreciation for the issues that you were addressing. And you mentioned that the report was from 2014. And certainly one of the great topics that we have around the council table, thanks to many of my colleagues, is climate change. And I'm just wondering if you've noticed changes in the weather patterns since 2014, like perhaps I have and others, where the rain is no longer this pleasant mist that continues to permeate, but more of a flash flood event. And if you would agree, if that's the type what we're seeing in the Kingston weather pattern.
I think we do see some of that, and we've also seen higher water levels and flooding. And so when we think about leaving contaminated sediments in place in some of the higher concentrated areas, we also need to think in the future, are we going to have higher water levels here that might mobilize these sediments more? So definitely thinking long-term is important.
So with that, understanding that this area is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we have in theory, with planning, a 30-meter ribbon of life of naturalized shoreline along the pathway. Yet if I was to purchase a waterfront property and build on it, I would have to be at least 100 meters back or 120 meters back, depending on the Conservation Authority. Would it be prudent then that any development we have along this waterway should be at least 100, 120 meters away from the shoreline as it exists today?
I don't know if I can weigh in on that. It's a bit outside of my domain to speak to today, but do you have any thoughts on that, Ken?
Well, I would leave it to others with more knowledge of that to answer that question, but I do hope that whatever way it's developed, and I think back, I chaired the Kingston Environmental Advisory Forum back in 2002, where we held a community workshop on the future of the Inner Harbor. And the conclusion was that they would, at that time, and I'm speaking for that time, was that the community wanted to see a revitalized harbor that can be used for the enjoyment of all. And I think that being able to allow the public to access waterfront in some way is really commendable in the city of Kingston.
So knowing that we still have potential leachate locations, I know that there's water that comes down from Montreal Street as far as the old railroad station and comes through and comes into the harbor. How would you recommend City Council position itself to say that if the Inner Harbor is to be addressed, that these other point sources of potential pollution and contaminants, where we've had other city businesses and other industry that water flows through into the harbor, how do we ensure that they get addressed as well without, and I know Councillor Hutchison alluded to that, but just give me some advice as a councillor how I would demonstrate to Transport Canada that we need to address other sources, not just the water source.
I think it's a question of relativity. I think that we are in an urban environment and there are always going to be inputs from our urban activities. This is not going to be returned to a pristine state because we live around it and there are inputs from it. The bulk of the contamination, I believe, is in the sediments. And so even though we might have small amounts coming in from the urban watershed, the bulk is sitting in the sediments, and that is what's posing the risk. And so if you deal with that, even if there are small amounts coming in, it doesn't overshadow the reason for doing the large cleanup.
And I would concur.
Okay. You mentioned that you had worked with stakeholders, and it was a large stakeholder group. Was Metalcraft Marine one of those stakeholders?
No, they weren't at the time, because we were focused mainly on the regulators and the owners. So we were trying to get the science of the project done. And so we did not develop our report beyond the idea of there was a problem, it needed to be dealt with. Here's some of the ways it could be dealt with, but it didn't move beyond that, which is what would be, how best to do that, how to implement that. And that would, of course, definitely engage the other stakeholders as well. So we were at the early stages. I mean, it was a 10-year project, but we funded it out of funds that we had within the Environmental Sciences Group. So it took a while to get it done. And so that is a necessary next step. And that's where where we are now, I guess, because you need to see what Transport Canada has done subsequent to our work. You need to hear their answers to the types of questions that we're posing here. And you need to have that engagement. I talked about those quality of life standards that Hudson River implied. I think that's really important. I mean, you can't proceed with the project without taking all those things into account. So that's the next step or steps that need to be done.
I'm glad you mentioned that. When you were doing this research over 10 years, what were the funding sources that supported your research?
We did a lot of basic and applied work with the Environmental Sciences Group. I mentioned the Dew Line. That was a huge project because we were the people who helped design the cleanup. And most importantly, we were chosen by federal government Inuit because we were an independent university body. As a university professor, even at a federal university like RMC, I had an academic freedom clause to do my own work and not report, not be subject to the direction of my employer. So Inuit saw that as a very profitable thing. So we applied in many cases a research overhead charge on many of that contract work we did, and we invested that work back into studies we did, including the Kingston Inner Harbor. And so that's how we did it, with a little bit at a time of spare funds that we had to invest in basic research and of the type that we just described. A number of students benefited as well. So labor was less expensive. Graduate students and undergraduate students contribute to the project, but overseen by a highly professional group of full-time professionals with master's and PhD degrees. So we're very confident of the quality of the work, and it withstood peer review. So we're pretty happy about it.
That's good. Now, Utilities Kingston has some significant infrastructure that runs across the basin, and it's south of the contaminated former lead smelter site. How would you propose dredging with those pipelines of sewer and water that go across the waterway?
Well, again, this is something the proponent will have to speak to, but I can tell you that I've been on dredging barges, and they are quite remarkable. And this was some years ago. I'm sure they're even more remarkable, but I remember sitting in one in the Fox River in Wisconsin, and the guy had a beautiful computer screen. They had detailed mapping of the river bottom. They knew where boat wrecks were, where obstacles were, et cetera. And so he could direct the dredge with great precision in and around things. In some areas, I presume they stayed away from with some sort of buffer zone. So the technology is quite sophisticated. So I can't see them cutting sewer lines, leading down to the sewage treatment plant. They would be pretty poor operators if they did that.
Speaking of operators, are you familiar with what kind of companies might be providing this kind of work, or of any names of companies that you're aware of?
I haven't been really engaged in most recent years in that, so I really would be remiss of me to try to name such companies. But
okay, I appreciate that, and that really wasn't a fair question. I'm assuming they're probably coming from Quebec, and they're riding a Papineau, and SNC Lavalin might be their names, but we'll leave that for another day. My final question really deals with turtles, and I've been heavily involved with trying to preserve turtles because they're such an incredible the janitors of the waterway, and I just love them because they're such an important creature in our communities. And when you talked about removing species such as fish and whatnot, I'm not sure turtles with an innate geolocation are easily transferred or moved. And so I'm wondering, understanding that aspect, if dredging, and we spoke about the environment and potential rises, is it not better to leave a naturalized shoreline and allow Mother Nature to address the shoreline, but do maybe perhaps the dredging below? But because I'm very concerned about the turtle population is going to be completely displaced.
I think this is a question again for the proponents, but the fact is that there is risk to the turtles through the contaminated prey that they would be eating from the area of contaminated sediments. And so you need to look at that as well as the habitat. I'm sure that the proponents have looked at habitat concerns closely, and these would be good questions to ask.
Yeah, well, we haven't seen any of the research from the proponents, so I can't comment. And obviously, you've indicated you haven't been able to see it either. So I'm hoping they're as diligent as you are after these 10 years that you put in, because it's a phenomenal report. It's definitely light reading. So I want to thank you for your previous efforts, and that concludes my questions.
Next is Councillor Arsenic.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you very much for your presentation and giving us these very detailed answers. It's helping us a lot learn about this process. I have a question for Dr. Reimer, and Dr. Reimer, you used the examples about the PCBs being removed in the Hudson River or Rocky Bay in Victoria, BC. In our situation, we're dealing more with heavy metals, correct? And so are the characteristics of BCBs or what's being removed in Rocky Bay, are they similar to the heavy metals that we're seeing here?
There's quite a mixture of contaminants in the Inner Harbor, and you're right. Some deal with things like chromium and lead. There are some PCBs, but certainly not. They're not the major contaminant as they were in the Hudson River. But in terms of their fact that they are adhering to sediment particles, that fact, they're less water soluble. The type of and form of chromium that's in the sediments is not water soluble, so it's attached to the sediments. They are behaving in similar ways in terms of they could be dredged or remediated in the same approach. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Yes, they're different chemicals, but they have that characteristic in common, and that will in fact facilitate the remediation process.
Thank you. And in your one slide, when you were talking about dredging, you had pore water, like P-O-R-E, pore water. Can you just describe that again?
Sure. I mean, when you think about how sediments at the bottom of a river or lake are formed, it's from material that runs off from the land. So soil particles, leaves and stuff, all kinds of things that run into the body of water. And they begin to accumulate and decay on the bottom of the water body. Of course, when they do so, they trap water as well. So as you go, if you were to take a tube and push it vertically into those sediments, you would collect mud that goes at the top, goes to the bottom, and depending how far you push, you'd find that there would be water still in between those sediment particles, less at depth than at the surface, because pressure would push it upwards. And so you would have still bits of water particles. So that's called pore water, the pores between the actual sediment particles themselves. So one of the things we looked at was, are there chemicals in the sediments that are dissolving into that pore water? Because that would be quite difficult to remediate, because when you were to start to remove the particles, the pore water escapes. And if the chemicals were dissolved in that pore water, that is very difficult to capture and could cause problems. But that's not the issue. The chemicals are largely attached, almost entirely attached to the sediment particles themselves. So that means that the mass amount of contaminant is attached to a solid object, not dissolved into the water, the so-called pore water. So it's a mass balance issue. There's far more mass of contaminant attached to the particles than dissolved in those little tiny pores of water that's trapped within the sediments themselves.
Collected pore water and looked at the chemical concentrations in it to be sure of that.
Okay, thank you very much. And my next question is about the monitoring that you showed that picture with the flotation and the water that was all murky, and then on the other side, it was clean. In this case, when we do the monitoring, if you were the lead company for this, right? What chemicals in the clear water on the other side of the boom would you be trying to test for to see if they were acceptable levels?
I'd be looking for turbidity. I'd be looking for sediment particles suspended in the water for one thing. because we also note that they don't dissolve very easily in water. But I suspect they would also, and this is the case, even though PCBs are very water insoluble, they don't dissolve very much in water. In Hudson River Project, they also even looked for very, very tiny concentrations of dissolved PCBs in the water itself. And they want to ensure that the disturbance of just the physical activity of dredging outside of those barriers was not exceeding a limit that they had predetermined. And they predetermined that limit by back calculating from what would affect anything on the other side. So you have to have a limit, and you have to make sure that your monitoring ensures you don't exceed that limit. And if you do, then you stop and you take action.
Thank you. And would we also then also test for the lead and the mercury, all those things that you showed in the slides? Would that be something we would test for on the one side and the other side as well?
They would largely attach the sediment particles, but there still would be a water sampling program in place.
Okay. I think I had another question related to the monitoring. Oh, and to what standard? Would it be, we'd be looking at to, if you were the lead project person, right? Would it be to a drinking water standard, or would it be to the standard for aquatic life? Are we worried? I think I heard you answer in previous, and Dr. Ling as well, saying that I don't have concerns with the contamination in the river to downstream drinking water. So
yeah, I mean, they'd be looking at standards. I can only speak to the project that I was involved in, where I know that we were looking at particulate matter with PCBs. I'm talking about the Hudson River now. The amount of that would be moving outside of any containment area, and also any dissolved. Even though it was very tiny amounts of dissolved stuff, they were concerned about drinking water that might be taken from the river downstream. And so they were calculating, if you have a certain amount released from a work area of a certain size, there is dilution, of course, because there's clean water that's now dissolving further that material. What would be that number that would be not acceptable to a downstream location? And they had various decisions about how far away. But because here we are looking at things that are quite water insoluble, I think that you're looking to make sure those sediment particles don't escape would be one of the principal things they would be monitoring for. Tammy, you got anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just those kind of standards, I believe are standard on dredging projects, to have performance standards that you look at like that. And I think with most, with the new dredging techniques, they're pretty effective, that often dredging projects, usually they can maintain those standards, that they don't cause releases.
thank you. And my final question is, since we did start to talk about dilution effects, since we're in a low water response right now, if that was just issued by the conservation area, and with climate change and our hotter summers, and right now even the shipping, the river for shipping is really low. Is it true then that the dilution effects for dredging we should make sure for this EIS that's going to happen, right? This EIA, that they have looked at dilution effects as current in light of climate change, because maybe the water was higher in the past compared to now, when we get these really dry summers and the water in the river is very low.
They'll have to speak to all of those issues when they're developing those standards. Those engineering performance standards are critical. They need to look at all facets of what might be, what could impact on them, I guess, is the short answer. I know they were exceptionally involved. I chaired a 12-person panel to develop those performance standards for the Hudson River. And so it was a lot of different expertise to come to the table to examine that question from many different angles.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Transport Canada will ask both of you to be their consultant on this study. That would be good. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next is Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and through you, thank you for the excellent presentation and what perhaps might be a record for a non-staff briefing to council. So this is great. I only have one question, and it's actually about performance standards, so it comes at a good time. Perhaps, Dr. Reimer, when we talk about performance standards, are we limited to ecological considerations like we've spent the last 2 hours talking about, or are there other things that a project like this should take into account from your experience at the Hudson River or elsewhere?
I think I mentioned the quality of life standards. I think those are important too. I mean, the Hudson River is, narrower in most sections of the river than the inner harbor. Well, probably in all sections, but it's wider and narrow. But it was heavily populated. It is a heavily populated river with businesses and homes and such along the shoreline. So they really looked at how long should a dredging day be? Would the lights and the noise from the dredging facilities impact on the local community? How would the dredging activities impact on local businesses? So those are all considerations, I think, that go into the development of a successful project, so that you get the community buy-in. I mean, community members need to express their concerns, and they need to be addressed. And I think that's the most important message I hope we're giving today, is that this can be done without it being a catastrophe. It can be done to make people comfortable. It can be done with a minimum disruption. There will be some, but minimum disruption, if all of these things are taken into account. And I think the outcome will be an important and favorable outcome. But they have to be addressed.
That holistic approach, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions at this point. Dr. Reimer and Dr. Lang, thank you very much for coming and for your presentation, for fielding those questions for us. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will move on in our agenda. We have no other briefings. Are there any petitions to present? Okay, we do have two motions, condolence and a motion of congratulations. So first, moved by Mayor Patterson, seconded by Deputy Mayor Neal. The sincere condolences of Kingston City Council will be extended to Kelly Horbay, Executive Assistant to the Commissioner of Transportation and Public Works, on the passing of her father, Frank Carnegie, on June 23, 2021. Frank joined the Canadian Armed Forces at age 17 and served for 35 years. A dedicated community servant, he thrived on mission for others. Our thoughts are with Kelly, her family, and friends during this difficult time. Moved by Mayor Patterson, seconded by Deputy Mayor Neal, that the sincere condolences of Kingston City Council be extended to the family and friends of Dino Bartzis, who passed away on July 4th, 2021. Dino immigrated to Canada from Greece as a young adult. His barbershop, Dino's Barbershop, has been a fixture in downtown Kingston for many years. Dino survived by his wife and their 2 sons, and our thoughts are with them during this difficult time. And then finally, moved by Mayor Patterson, seconded by Councillor Kiley, that the sincere congratulations of Kingston City Council be extended to Councillor Mary Rita Holland on the completion of her PhD in Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University. Last month, Councillor Holland successfully defended her doctoral thesis examining the role of family caregivers in rural New Brunswick. Congratulations, Dr. Holland. Okay, with that, we will call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, we have no deferred motions, and so we will move on to reports. First, we have report number 64 from the CAO.
Moved by Councillor Kiley, seconded by Councillor Arsenic, that report number 64 from the Chief Administrative Officer, consent, be received and adopted.
There are 7 clauses. Would anyone like any of those clauses separate? Councillor Doherty.
Thanks. And through you, can we separate clause number 5? The reserve fund clause.
So we'll separate clause number 5. Okay, any other separations? Councillor Chappelle?
Thank you, Your Worship. Clause number 3, please.
3. Okay, seeing no other separations, we'll deal with the balance of the clauses. So first, clause 1, 2021 City of Kingston Arts Fund grant recommendations. Clause number 2, award of contract, City Hall stairwell equipment relocation. Clause number 4, special occasion permit, Love Kingston Marketplace Sundays on Court. Clause number 6, Community Investment Fund 2021 funding recommendations. Clause number 7, road safety enhancements. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, flipping back then to clause 3, review of council remuneration for the 2022 to 2026 term, creation of a citizen committee to review council remuneration. Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, Your Worship. I found this an interesting approach, having a citizens committee. I was hoping that the clerk might be able to walk me through this as it addresses, I guess the remuneration for all potential councillors in the future. And I think a little more discussion needs to happen than simply this brief report. I don't necessarily understand why this can't be like. I'd like to understand the structure, and then maybe I'll have some additional questions. So I'd just like the clerk to speak to it for me, please.
Thank you for that question, Councillor. The model that you have before you is a model that we've used since 2008. It's really an independent process whereby it's really community driven and it allows the community to maintain autonomy as they review the remuneration provided to members of council. It's been a successful process over the last number of years. It's supported by both the clerk's department and the human resources and organization department. Basically, we go out and with an EDI lens, we recruit the members independently from various sectors within the city, as well as the former member of council and 2 members of the public. What we found in the past is that this diverse group is able to work with us to take a look at our comparators and to take a look at other things that we think are important. For this exercise, we're also going to take a look at the possible support that can be provided to members of council to assist them to do their work. So our goal is to have the recommendation approved this evening, start with the targeted diverse recruitment, make the appointments, which will be going to council solely for ratification, and start the process to get the work undertaken prior to the next election, with our goal being of having a report to council, a final report in Q4 2021.
Thank you for the clarity. I do have one question, and you referenced it, and it's something that I know has been an issue for this council, and it's been more complex with COVID and other pressures that we're facing, and that is the idea of assistance. Will you be having consultations with current council members as to look at what means might be more of an assistance to council to be better prepared for some of these long agenda nights? Someone does independent research for us to help pull information together so that we can ask articulate and thoughtful questions rather than being reactive. Is that what you're implying with regards to potential supports?
Your Worship, that's an excellent question, Councillor. Absolutely. In the past, we have interviewed all members of council who have offered to be interviewed, and through their assistance, we've been able to bring forward recommendations that have allowed council, I think, to thrive term after term. So this is no different than what we've done in the past with that regard. The issue of council support is something that we recognize in the clerk's department and indeed with the corporations as a whole. It's time that we fully address that in order to allow you to have the tools to do your job. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That concludes my questions.
Okay, thank you. So we will call the vote on, I'm sorry, Councillor Stroud, did you want to speak to it as well? Councillor Stroud, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. So Mr. Clerk, I have a couple more questions. So you've just said that this is essentially the process we've used in the past since 2008. Is that true of the third clause of the recommendation, that the community members on the committee are chosen by the appointed sector representatives?
Your Worship, that is correct. That has been the process that we brought forward in 2008, and it's been used ever since and been recommended as following today.
Okay, so let's just examine that a little further. So what you're saying is that there is a that in clause 2A that that essentially staff has chosen 3 sectors to volunteer or to come forward with an appointee, of course non-elected, to sit on the committee. These appointees will essentially be sent to us by these individual groups that are chosen by staff. And then those appointees chosen by the individual groups essentially populate the rest of the committee. Is that correct?
Your Worship, that is correct. Just for correction purposes, there are 5 sectors that staff will be engaged with in terms of determining who their representatives and alternatives would be. And then this group then would take a look at the applications from former members of council as identified in the report, as well as undertake a review of applications that will come in from the 2 public members who will also form a part of this group. So you will have a group of 8 people that will be doing the review. And as I said before, they'll be supported by both the Clerk's Department and the Human Resources and Organization Department.
Okay, so 5 groups chosen by staff put forward an appointee. Those 5 appointees choose the other 3 members of the committee, and that group of 8 makes the rest of the decisions.
To Your Worship, that is fundamentally correct. Yes.
Okay, so the obvious question for someone who hasn't been following this process, and just for transparency, is how does staff come up with the list of 5 appointees that will have this great power of essentially determining the future of council remuneration?
To Your Worship, as indicated before, the process we've followed is to identify 5 specific sectors within the community, that being the business community, the healthcare community, the nonprofit sector, the educational community, as well as the organized labor community. And with the representatives that they provide to us, when I say us, I'm talking about the corporation, they then undertake the next step, which is to populate the committee with a former member of council as well as 2 public representatives. As indicated previously, this is one of those committees that really works independently of council. It's to maintain the autonomy and the openness and transparency afforded to this group. All meetings of this group are open to the public. So there will be agendas, there will be minutes, and there will be opportunities for participation. There could be survey work. There's a number of things that will go into a work plan for this group to execute. As I said before, one of the issues, and I believe you brought this issue up, councillors, with respect to council support, and we have heard you, and that will be part of this review as well.
Thank you. Yes, and not only have you heard us, but in strategic planning, Commissioner Joyce actually pledged to do something about it, which we have yet to see. I have another question about these appointees. So for example, it says the healthcare community. Well, the healthcare community is rather vague, and it says University Hospitals Kingston is the group that is approached. How many times since 2008 has this sector volunteered a union member as a representative from the healthcare community, which, as we all know, all nurses are union members. So what I'm really asking is, how many times has a nurse been part of this process as volunteered by University Hospitals Kingston?
So through you, Your Worship, in terms of how many times has this individual been a nurse, I don't have that information before me at this time. I can tell you that every sector identified in the recommendation did provide representation on this type of committee since 2008. But I do not know if one of them was a nurse or not. And it would be really a representative from—
You don't know. You don't know. Say you don't know.
I don't know.
Okay, well, I think the answer is 0. And the reason for that is when you ask the University Hospitals Kingston management to volunteer a representative, they give you a representative from management, which by definition is a non-union representative. You have one sector, Kingston District Labor Council, which probably does the reverse, always puts forward a representative from labor. But that is the only sector here of the 5 that ever selects a labor representative. So is it true that what you've done is you've enabled a system where only 20% of the sector's representatives are from labor, and the remaining community representatives are chosen by a group that are 80% non-labor representatives? Yes or no?
I don't know if I would agree with that statement. As I said before, the representative from the healthcare community from the University Hospitals Kingston, I'm unable to advise you whether or not that's a union or non-union position, as you questioned me on. So taking a look at just what you said there with respect to the 80-20 split, I'm saying that that could be possible, but I wouldn't stand behind that at this point.
Well, then I'll ask it in a different way. Has there been any instance since 2008?
So, Councillor Stroud,
the 5 sectors
Councillor Stroud, I'm going to stop you that you've asked the question. Staff have tried to respond.
No, I'm
You
going to
can't keep
ask
asking. You can't keep asking the same question in different ways.
It has not been answered, Your Worship. I'm asking it a different way so that it is answered
So
properly.
the answer was, I don't know.
Well, the answer is no, not I don't know. The answer is no. And I could illustrate that by asking it a different way.
Councillor Stroud, your question has been asked. Staff have provided an answer. It's up to you then how you would want to proceed. But I cannot allow continuing ask the same question over and over.
I have a different question, Your Worship.
That's fine. Go ahead, Councillor Stroud.
Thank you. Has there ever been, of the 5 representatives, more than one union member?
To Your Worship, I believe I've tried to answer that question. There's nothing more than I can add at this time.
I'll take that as a no. I think it's pretty clear what staff is recommending. So my final question is about this. Why is it that staff sees it priority to recommend a process at all and not leave it up to a strategic discussion amongst the current members of council?
To Your Worship, this is a process which we have utilized throughout my tenure here, let's put it that way, since 2008, which I believe has been successful with respect to ensuring that the council remuneration is at a level which is competitive with our competitors, or our comparators, I should say. At the same time, we've taken a look at other opportunities for engagement and outreach with respect to trying to determine the workload of members of council, whether or not it's truly reflective in the remuneration that is attached. So we feel that this process works. It's a process that other municipalities have started to follow. And it's up to council to decide whether or not they want this process to continue. We're, as staff, bringing the recommendation forward. If council is the opinion that they don't want to follow the staff recommendation, council is free to do as they choose.
Thank you. I have one final question, and I mean no disrespect, Mr. Clerk. My questions regarding union representation are legitimate and are simply to highlight the fact that those making this recommendation are not union members. Now, my final question has nothing to do with that. My final question—
Mr. Stroud, you're at 5 minutes. Unless you can give your question in 10 seconds.
Sorry, my final question is related to what Councillor Spell said about assistance. Will the clerk commit to actual assistance coming to council members of by any particular date? Will the clerk?
Councillor Stroud, so I'm going to stop you there. Mr. Clerk.
Your Worship, that is one of the areas that we're reviewing as part of this undertaking. So we will provide, when I say we, the committee will provide a recommendation to council, and we expect that that recommendation will go to council by Q4 2021.
Okay, thank you. So next on my speakers list is Deputy Mayor Neal.
Just very quickly, I thought that the way the 2018 review rolled out was very sensible. And the reason was that council set up a committee of citizens to review what other municipalities were doing and so on. In the 1990s, I have to say, it was always left up to council. And quite frankly, I don't think that that's the right way to go about it. What happened then was some people were concerned about upcoming election or their electability, and they ended up voting no to the recommendation, even though they would count the vote and then vote no to please some of their constituents, but afterwards would say, boy, I'm glad that passed. And that, I think, is what we want to avoid. We don't want this council being seen as voting on our own raise, or the future council doing the same. And I don't think any of us were done poorly by the decision that was brought forward in 2018. So I would strongly suggest that we maintain that system. I would love to see more labor representatives on there as well, or people with lived experience on there as well. And that's something, I mean, Councillor Stroud was perfectly within his rights to bring those questions forward. So, but I think the system itself is a good system and we shouldn't abandon it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Bone.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, I know that the previous speaker mentioned like a wonderful system, and ultimately, I believe the perception is that we ultimately approve whatever comes out of the recommendation from this working group or whatever you want to call it. So really, at the end of the day, I've already had feedback from multiple constituents that although it's not us that actually decides the remuneration, we actually vote on the approval of it. So essentially, we do still vote our own raise, if you will. So I do agree with it maintaining this sort of third-party distance separation from us. However, I do have a question to staff is right now we're just simply talking about remuneration, and I've looked at multiple other municipalities that have a population greater than ours that actually have fewer councillors representing that population. So how would we expand the mandate of this committee to essentially include something like elections at large rather than ward councillors, and actually looking at reducing the number of councillors to go towards a full-time position? Because one of the things that came out of the last was the fact that with this number of councils, it becomes financially unfeasible to actually have full-time councillors because there are so many of us.
Through your worship, that's a great question, Councillor. That would be a slightly different process with respect to this. If you're talking about reducing the number of councillors, changing the ward boundaries, there's a specific process under the legislation that goes about to do that. A little late in the game to be talking about elections at large, as well as the reduction of councillors. So as I said before, that is something that is independent of this. It's not something that this committee, I think, could really focus on if we wanted to get a response back to council for Q4 to have it in place for the next council that will be coming in 2022.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Yeah, I think I'm curious about it. So I mean, looking at something like that would be appreciated. Having heard feedback from numerous constituents. You know, the ward system has its advantages, but also its disadvantages, and I think that was represented mostly in the votes for the third crossing, where issues across the city aren't necessarily represented equally. A further question to that would be, in the composition of the committee, is there a possibility to, I guess, seek a greater balance, and this is in reference to Councillor Stroud's concerns, is to seek a greater balance amongst kind of working class versus managerial class, to sort of understand the struggles that councillors face that have, I guess, multiple jobs, or maybe from union versus managerial positions, just to achieve, I guess, a greater sort of representation of, you know, the actual role that we play within the community. Is that something we can strive towards within the composition of the committee in the future?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that is once again a great question. That is something we could strive for in the future. I know that through our recruitment, we're taking a look at this with an EDI lens to ensure that we've got the right people in place with the right skill set to be able to undertake the reviews. So we'll take all those comments into advisement, and we hope that we will get a good committee that will able to provide some strong recommendations for council's consideration in Q4 2021.
Great, thank you. Always appreciate your answers, Mr. Clerk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. Through you, quickly, similar to Councillor Boehm's questions, actually, Mr. Clerk, could we just have a footnote in the report or some clear indication of what comparator municipalities have full-time councillors, so we know what we're talking about, compare apples to apples when we look at those numbers?
Through your worship, yes, we can.
Thanks so much.
Okay, I don't have any other speakers on my list, so we will call the vote on clause 3. All those in favor? Opposed? And that carries. Councillor Chappelle and Councillor Stroud opposed. The vote would be 9-2. Okay. Moving on to clause 5, repeal of bylaw number 2000-254, a bylaw to establish reserve funds for the corporation of the city of Kingston as amended. Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I just wonder if staff could just offer some details on the reasoning behind this before we vote, and just in general, I also have a question. Like, will we still see detailed sums for reserve accounts, or does this consolidated account mean that we will no longer be seeing those detailed accounts?
Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. So this report is before council really just as a housekeeping item. The original bylaw that we're asking to be repealed was done back in 2000 before some major changes to the Municipal Act. And at that time, it did require a bylaw listing reserve funds that had previously been approved by council. And we also had to have council approval in order to consolidate our funds for investment purposes. The Municipal Act would, at the time, only allow us to invest each reserve fund separately. And so that's why that bylaw was put in place. When the Municipal Act was significantly changed in 2001, a lot of those changes did relate to the reserve fund requirements and took out a lot of those requirements. However, what did remain is that council still has to approve whenever we are putting funds into a reserve fund or when we're taking funds out. And so we don't have to have this separate bylaw anymore. And the Municipal Act does allow for us now to be able to consolidate consolidate our funds for investment purposes. But Councillor Doherty, just to assure you, the reporting will still stay the same. This consolidation is really just for investment purposes, and it allows us to be able to have a bigger pool of monies, particularly for our longer term investments, and that opens up some of our better investment opportunities. We'll still provide detail at budget time, and as part of the audited financial statements, you'll still see all the detailed reserve funds and the balances that are in them. And going forward, you'll also still have the opportunity to approve when monies are going in, particularly at budget time. We would have those as part of budget or as separate council reports, or as part of the fourth quarter report. We often are asking council to approve monies to go into reserve funds, and also monies coming out. You'll also see that as part of our capital reports. We have one on there tonight, and that's one of the reasons we have those quarterly reports for capital, is so that council is approving the movement of those funds back and forth. So none of that piece will change.
Thank you. I really appreciate your detailed response. Thanks.
Okay, so we will call the vote on clause number 5. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, it is 9:16, so I will propose at this point we will take a 10-minute recess and reconvene at 9:26. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, folks, it's 9:27. My apologies. So we will reconvene at this point. So we've come to the end of report number 64. So now we'll move on to report 65 from the CAO.
Moved by Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor Arsenic, that report number 65 from the Chief Administrative Officer recommend be received and adopted clause by clause.
So just before we proceed any further, it is 9:28. We still do have a fair bit of work ahead of us in the agenda. So if we, looks like we are not going to be able to get through the majority of this agenda by 11:30 or so, then my intention is to recess and to reconvene tomorrow at 7. So we'll see how things go, but I just believe that there's only so long any single council meeting should go. So just throwing it there. So with that, we move to the individual clauses of report number 65. So number 1, a bylaw to provide procedural, financial, and other governance structures to the Downtown Business Improvement Area Board of Management. Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Clause 2, Tiny Homes Micro Living Spaces Pilot Project Habitat for Humanity. Councillor.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and through you, and apologies to Councillor Neal. Councillor Neal, I think you asked this at the beginning of the meeting, but I'm wondering how the new zoning bylaw would apply to this project, because tiny homes are something that will be explicitly contemplated, as we've seen at Planning Committee in the last few meetings that we've had.
Sure.
I believe Commissioner Agnew's power might have went off because mine just completely dipped.
I think she might be frozen.
Yeah, or something.
Lanny's got her hand up.
I know. CAO Hurdle? So I think this might be the first time that 2 senior staff members have frozen at exactly the same time.
Huge lightning strike in the West End. Seriously, it was my.
Something's going on. Those are the moments where I have to stop and be like, am I frozen? And everybody else, is it okay? I don't think so. Ms. Nordegraff, you do not look frozen. Would you answer that question?
Thank you, and through you. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing that I'm not frozen. And I do apologize because I am not the expert on planning. I do know that there are, not to put some other planning staff on the spot, just improvising here. I know Director Park is on the call that hopefully is not frozen and potentially can chime in.
Mr. Park.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I must apologize. I am not familiar with the details as Commissioner Agnew would be on the tiny homes report. So I'm hesitant to give any information at the moment that would be inaccurate.
That's fine, Mayor Patterson. We can address it another time, and it's still working its way through committee anyway. So I just thought maybe context now would be helpful, but another time is okay too.
Okay, that's great. Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. So the first question I did hear from the delegation from the perspective of Habitat for Humanity on what the potential might be for the arrangement for maintenance on the site, or any kind of relationship with the city, I guess, related to just how this is all going to work out as far as having the city and then the partner and the rental and the issue of potential overall maintenance. So I would like to hear from city staff as well, because I know we have similar situations. For example, Kingston Frontenac Housing Corporation, where we are in a situation working in partnership with a nonprofit to provide housing. And then that property is owned by an organization, a nonprofit that is that then is sort of working, I guess, working with the city on those property standards issues. So this is to address some concerns from residents about potential property standards issues on the site. So any information on that would be great.
Ms. Nordegraff.
Thank you, and through you, thanks for that question. So yes, the delegation did address this briefly and also alluded to the fact that obviously this is a first step. There's still a lot of engagement and work that needs to be done to, finalize some of those additional partnerships. And the one thing that I will say is this is not an RGI project. This is a new pilot. And really that relationship between the tenants and the support services will be crucial. So we will be very closely connected as a corporation, Housing and Social Services Department, to create those relationships and to really make sure that tenants are part of potential, maintenance and property, kind of hands-on kind of participation, which would potentially reduce some of those concerns. But again, I think we are at a stage that there's still a lot of engagement and planning, that we have to initiate or further kind of communicate and discuss with Habitat and other partners. So we obviously again have opportunities to bring in partners that also provide services at the Vido Heights Community Center. So we're very aware of those concerns, and they certainly will be part of coming up with a I guess, programming that would prevent that from happening. And again, we do have as a city that ability as well to work with Habitat through our agreements as well.
Okay, thanks very much. And through you, Mayor Patterson, the next question is regarding the timeline. And I know that when in initial conversations with staff on this project, it sounds like it could move quite quickly. And of course, there's the planning process, but the to date, I haven't heard from residents. I haven't heard much, I guess, from residents in the area. And I know going back to earlier discussions about that parcel of land and the future of market, of a sort of a different style of housing and a different type of housing in the area, including market based housing. When we had the consultations with the community at that time, people were quite concerned about potential for density in the area. And this is obviously not that. It's not, and it's a different, it's one section of the property. But just sort of, I'm just going on those conversations for my feedback tonight, because as I said, I haven't heard a lot, but I'm concerned that I haven't heard a lot, because when we had those engagement exercises before, there were quite a number of community members who had input on the potential development of that site. So given the potential for a tight sort of turnaround, and the fact that we've been in summer and people are not as focused on these kinds of issues as they might be another time of the year, if staff had any information on how, just beyond, I guess, the what happens with planning, how we might be involving the community and getting more input.
Okay, I see both Ms. Nordegraff and Mr. Park have their hands raised. So who would like to jump in first?
I'm happy through you to kick it off on the non-planning specific engagements. There certainly is also the, as a next step, because we first obviously wanted to go to council to present this pilot to you before we would move forward, and Director Park can speak to the planning specific next steps, because there will be further planning approvals, as you mentioned, Councillor Holland. But there also will be, kind of in line with the Vido Heights regeneration consultation, that this location will be similar as kind of the density that was presented in the Vido Heights regeneration, but obviously it's a slightly different approach now, having this tiny homes pilot as also in response to council's priority. So that's a very long, I guess, introduction to say, yes, we We will, as part of the next step, also create a community engagement process and really want to work with the neighbors beyond the planning, kind of the regulatory planning pieces, to make sure that this is, a community that within a community and is supported and fits within the community. So absolutely, this is part of the process and one of the next steps.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. And first of all, I've been texted by Commissioner Agnew. The power is out in her house, so that is why she was lost from the meeting. To follow up, I believe, on Councillor Kiley's question, and also to further what Director Nordegraff has just said, the report that was being referred to went to Planning Committee on June 23rd, and it was actually an information report only. It was not making recommendations. And the purpose of the report was to provide background information and obtain feedback from the public and members of Planning Committee with respect to the topic of tiny houses, shipping containers, and additional residential units, in order to inform how these items will be addressed in the second draft of the zoning bylaw when it's released to the public, which is anticipated towards the end of 2021. So there will be ongoing consultation with the public regarding tiny homes and the like, and they will be brought forward as a recommendation report to Planning Committee and ultimately to Council through a statutory meeting process. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So just a few thoughts then on the report in general. During the Mayor's Task Force on Housing, we did hear a lot from members of the public on the desire for different types of housing, and not just sort of members of the community, but people who have been working in this area for a long time. As was noted earlier, the demand for smaller pieces of property or smaller living spaces, and the autonomy, of course, which the delegation spoke to quite well. I think that all of that really demonstrates that there's certainly a desire and a need for the kind of housing that's being proposed. One other thing, upon first reading this, of course, it's the fact that this model is tied to our housing wait list is really what jumps out as the most beneficial part of this potential project, because we are constantly looking for ways to move those people from the list into a quality, affordable housing. This provides a way to do that. I mean, a small-ish number, but I think it does, the fact that it provides a new housing model for people on that wait list is really important, because many of them perhaps have different needs and might not be able to, even when housing is offered, it might not be the most appropriate kind. It might not be the kind of housing they want. So I think this will actually really provide a good benefit to how we continually work through our wait list, it's slow going as it is. And also I think the benefit of the pilot to tenants is there is a benefit, of course, to us to sort, and to the community at large, to figure out what more we can do and how well this model functions. But I think for people on the wait list, the benefit is that they'll have the opportunity to enter into this situation, become a tenant, see if it suits their needs, and if they want to move on, they can do so, and then of course someone else can take that space. So rather than have the units be designated for a long period of time to an individual, this does seem to serve the needs of people who may go and may stay there for long periods of time, and that would be wonderful, but some may not. So yeah, overall, I think the style of this project looks really promising. And of course, I'll be following all the engagement stuff really closely and bringing forward any concerns I hear from the residents. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Hill.
Thank you. And through you, Your Worship, I'm going to support this project. I think it's a great and important initiative, but I am a little surprised at the cost. So I'm looking at basically around $900,000 that the city is putting into the project. Material costs would be on top of that. Can you give me or can someone give us an estimate on what the individual costs of these tiny houses will be, and whether or not we see down the road that maybe, we can streamline these costs a little bit? Because I was sort of hoping that we would be able to produce more of them, to be frank, with the contribution that's being put in by the city at this point.
Okay, CEO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I apologize. I had to log in from my phone. The power went out. Thank you for the question, Councillor Hill. So the cost of construction itself is about $80,000 per tiny home. The additional costs that are identified in the staff report are actually costs that are related to fees that are applicable to all construction. So that would include development charges, which I think are outlined in there, the consultant fees, etc. So those tend to actually be quite expensive for any development. So those are in addition, obviously, to the $80,000 per unit, which is actually quite reasonable at $80,000. Most units that we've been working with in the last, I'm going to say, couple of years at least, for affordable housing have been in the range of $150,000 per unit for a one-bedroom apartment.
Thank you. I guess that kind of begs another question, but I'm glad to hear that the costs are what kind of in line with what I hoped that they would be. But we might want to take another look at those development charges down the road too. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And next, Councillor Chappelle, did I see your hand? Yeah, go ahead.
So when I saw this report and knowing that Habitat for Humanity was involved, I was really excited, because I think one of the greatest assets of the programs we currently do is help people who are the working poor, those that have the minimum wage jobs or less well-paid jobs, that allow them to then transition into home ownership and have that sense of pride and moving forward. So I was just a little concerned when I heard about the idea of this being rental units. And so please provide me the clarity that these would be ideally for a person to have a long-term commitment at a tiny home, or is this looking to be a rotational rental unit? And I really can gauge that. Just some clarity would be great.
Ms. Portergraph.
Sorry, of course that happens. Through you, happy to start answering that question. So first of all, Councillor Chappelle, the initial, as the delegation mentioned, the initial intent is this to be the first 8 units to be rentals, but there is the potential to also move them into home ownership along the line. So there's definitely that opportunity. And yes, the clients that would move into this project, their kind of rent is based on 25% of their income. And the intent is also to move them ideally up into income, so they would move along in the housing continuum and have some rotation in this project. So of course, again, we would have to, we are working with partners around, skills development, food, services. There's a lot of different kind of potential social and community partnerships that we have had some preliminary conversations with, that we want to further establish to really support people in that journey. But as the delegation mentioned, Habitat is very familiar with that process and moving people along that housing continuum. So that's definitely the intent. We would like to see people move in and at some point move forward in their housing journey.
So my question is, would this be the working poor, typically a person who's earning an income at a low wage or precarious employment, but actually earning an income, or would the residents be on ODSP or OW?
It probably would be a combination. We've identified that in the reports, but again, yes, the intent is to cater to people that are able to move along the housing continuum and have that ability to that are kind of the working or as you mentioned.
Thank you.
Okay. So seeing no other questions, we will call the vote on clause 2. All those in favor? Opposed? And that carries. I'm sorry, Councillor Stroud opposed. Okay, moving on to clause number 3, Kingston Transit 2021-2022 post-secondary student transit pass. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? And that carries. Okay, clause 4, request for extension of noise exemption, Queen's University, Richardson Stadium. Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. Perhaps staff could ask, or I could ask staff a question about the days. When I asked Ms. Delsin the question about when the noise exemption would be warranted, she said that it would be posted on their website. Is there any way that we can amplify that just so residents are aware? And I know that I've heard from some folks who are wondering about this.
Yes, Ms. Kempner-Hunt.
Sorry, I guess crazy weather out there. Thank you, and through you, Mayor Patterson, yeah, we can definitely, Queens is committed to put it on their website, and they've also committed to providing licensing and enforcement of the tournament schedule once they have it. So once we have that, we can post that on our website as well so that there's more visibility.
Well, that'd be great. And going forward, my preference for what it's worth would be to know the dates in advance, but I recognize that the scheduling this year must be near impossible, so I'm okay with it.
Okay. Councillor Chappelle.
Thank you, Your Worship. Given that we're still in the COVID pandemic and we have a lot of like touch and go opportunities, why would we have a blanket approval this year? Why wouldn't we just simply go a one-on-one, when a date's confirmed, this is what we're doing, and then consult, rather than this blanket approach?
Thank you, and through you, Mayor Patterson, Queens tends to do the blanket approach every time, and Council has approved them since 2014. So we do have the opportunity under the bylaw to impose conditions that Council considers appropriate.
I suppose what bothers me is that the dates will be posted on the website was the answer, and so I'm not going to support this motion. I would rather see them come back time and time again to reapply. Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody else that wishes to speak to clause number 4? Okay, we will call the vote then. All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, I'm going to do that vote one more time. All those in favor? 7 opposed? 3, Councillor Stroud, Hutchison, and Chappelle opposed. Okay, moving on to clause number 5. Request for exemption from section 45 of the Planning Act in relation to minor variance application for the lands known municipally as 233 Colburn Street. Any discussion? Okay, we'll call the vote then. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, clause 6, approval of brownfield financial benefits for 2 River Street and 50 Orchard Street, former Davis Tannery. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you. Asking this question on behalf of a few constituents who read the newspaper article recently. can we confirm or deny that, well, I guess I just asked the question. Are there any public funds, gathered from tax dollars that are being directed towards the property owner in this case?
Commissioner Hugenboss.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councilor McLaren. So as per the history of the Brownfields program, the Community Improvement Plan, there's no direct payment of public funds to support this development. Should this pass tonight and should the planning approvals approve the tannery development, any money that is paid to the developer to recover the costs of the remediation, just going through some heavy lightning here. Others are probably experiencing the same.
We'll give you a redo on your answer, Commissioner Hugenboss. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the cost of the remediation would be rebated to the developer through the new incremental taxes that are fully paid on the site once the site is fully developed. So there's no payment of public funds at this time, and there's no rebating of any of the taxes that are paid on the future development until that development occurs, and all the taxes are paid on an annual basis.
It's great to hear. And may I ask, considering the life cycle cost benefit, I understand that this project is going to be more expensive from the start, but over the period of the entire life cycle of the project, can we say that this is going to contribute a net benefit to the community, or will it be subsidized by the community at any time in the future or over its life cycle?
So I did hear the question, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure if you can see me. Okay, sorry.
Yes, yeah, we
okay,
can see.
Thank you. My screen is going back and forth, off and on, so I apologize. So thank you, Councilor McLaren. So short answer, yes, over the entire lifespan of the project, it is a net benefit. It is intensification in our downtown with condo and multi-residential development. And it is, yes, the most expensive cleanup we've had in the Brownfields program, and we've had many projects and expensive cleanups. But this is a significant amount of units and densification in the downtown, and including condo units. And as per the life cycle study of costs and infrastructure that council received last meeting, I believe, or the meeting before, that is an ideal level of investment and residential development for the city.
Thank you very much.
So I'm just going to pause for a moment. So I noticed that I think because of some power outages that there are a couple of councillors that have lost connection. So right now we do have quorum, but only just. So I just wanted to note that if we lose quorum or if we lose power at City Hall, which is obviously where we're hosting this meeting, then we will at that point reconvene at 7 o'clock tomorrow. For now, we will continue, but I just wanted to throw that out there because if we lose power, then you won't be able to hear from me. So next on my list is Deputy Mayor Neal.
Two very quick questions for Mr. Hugenboss that I should know the answer to, but my memory isn't serving me well. This was a project that was supposed to be in 4 components, divided into 4, and in the funding will be based on each of those 4, the brownfield funding, and what would happen if the funding flows to the developer and for some reason he goes bankrupt.
Thank you, Councillor Neal, and through you, Mayor Patterson. So the funding is through rebates paid to the owner of the property based on taxes that are paid. So the buildings don't get built, each phase doesn't get built without a record of site condition, building permits, planning approvals, all that sort of thing. And you can't get a record of site condition without the full remediation being done. So all the money that goes back is through the rebates of the taxes. So I think what you're asking is if it was bankrupt before the development was completed, then there wouldn't be payment because there's no new taxes being generated because the development wasn't completed.
I appreciate that. It's all coming back to me now. Thank you.
You got it.
Yeah, Councillor Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay, I'm going to take a different tact here. I've talked to Mr. Mahugalas about this a couple of times, and I don't agree with the analysis. So when the developer has to pay their taxes in the first full year after completion of each phase, correct?
Yes, as soon as the development is finished, taxes start getting paid.
Fine.
Okay. Yes, I see that point of order, Deputy Mayor Neal. It looks like we have gained Councillor Kiley and lost Councillor Hutchison. This is the most interesting council meeting I have ever chaired. I will tell you that right now. So if you're frozen, you don't count towards quorum. That's the rule. It's 1, 2. Okay. So I'm going to circle back. I'm going to give Councillor Hutchison another chance to come in on this. Oh, Councillor Hutchison, you're back. We lost you. Can you hear me?
So
you have the floor.
I don't see him. Oh, there he is. Okay. There he is again. He's a magician, but I was part of his trick. So, okay. So my point is this: tax revenues received from this development or any other taxpayer is city tax revenue. Is that not correct?
You, boss.
Yes, that's correct. And I also have the city treasurer, I hope, still on the call, who might be able to assist later on in your question, Councillor Hudson.
But that's the only important thing at the moment. The money rebated is called a tax rebate in this report, as it was in the previous one. Rebated back to the developer is city tax revenue, used usually for municipal services, correct?
Ms. Kennedy can correct me, but tax revenues are used for city services and anything council chooses to invest taxes in.
I've got something. Okay, so I don't accept the answer you gave. I know why you gave it. And in the study, it indicates that for every $1 million in tax revenues, the city rebates, tax rebate, $900,000 back to the developer to pay for the remediation costs. That would be correct too, right?
That is
even mentioned on page 182 of the 382 pages we received tonight. It says 899,000, but let's not quibble. $900,000 out of the $1 million is rebated to the developer. And then it indicates that 0.35% shortfall on annual gross taxation revenues is what is the argument given. There's not really an argument there. The point is this: $900,000 per phase per year for 10 years is $9 million. Okay, 4 phases times 9 million is $36 million, not chump change. It goes back to this developer, to offset his remediation costs. On top of that, there's $9 million in development charges that we're not collecting. So now we're up to 45 million. So this is a big deal. So, and I hope council appreciates that. It's a big, big deal. And it's by far, as Mr. Hugenboss allowed, the biggest brownfields we've had. My argument was at the last meeting and this meeting is it's a bridge too far. And I would like in many ways see it developed, and there's lots of people in my district who feel differently. Some do, some don't. But what I want to do is, if we're going to vote on this, we better be very clear about what we're doing. $45 million being rebated to pay the developer back to bring property up to a greenfield standard. That's what's going on. So I don't know if the clerk got my previous email. So there it is. So this is a very quick take, but this proposal says 1,500 apartments or condos, and it's $4 million for municipal taxation. In each phase, there's 375 units. Now, the problem arises when you realize that once built, we have to supply municipal services to every one of those households. In every phase, 375, or when it's complete, 1,500. Now, the developer estimates $1 million in taxation, and these numbers are not, I'm trying to make a point of principle here, which is largely correct. So you can see that we minus $900,000 tax rebate from the 1 million is we have $100,000 available to us to pay for all the municipal services that we as a city pay for. Now, the average household taxation per year to cover all municipal services is $3,600. That's 2021. It's, if you look at
30 seconds.
Okay, so my point is that works out to $50 million. And even if you change it and accept the developer estimate, it's still $36 million plus development charges. I think that's too much.
Okay, thank you. Next on my list is Councillor Bill.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you. Just to follow up on this, and I understand Councillor Hutchison's concerns. In speaking with so many members of the community on this, it's also, I mean, we're going to have concerns about it regardless. But there's an opportunity here, and I don't think we can just quickly push that aside. I mean, there's a reason we created a brownfield program, and there's a reason why this is such a complicated project. This is something that I can't remember I remember the number exactly from the report. It was something like $3,800 in tax dollars that we got from this property currently. And I mean, if we had to give that back over 10 years or even 20 years to make this work, I mean, it's a net gain in the end. This will be developable property for the future after this that will not have the contamination that currently sits on it. So it's basically something the city needs to partner with a private developer to do to actually bring remediation to the site to allow us to actually have it as a functional space within the city. There's so much opportunity here, but there's such a cost to basically, gaining that opportunity. So I think this is something that staff is likely working very hard on, as well as any developer that would take this on is something that needs to be considered strongly. And with the realization that we may not have an opportunity like this before us within this term of council, and certainly maybe not even within the next 2 terms of council. So this is a challenging development. It's always going to be a challenging development. If we have to spend money or forgo money on this to turn this into functional land for the benefit of the city, I think it's contingent on us to actually really think about what that actually means going forward. So yes, will it cost money? Definitely. Is there going to be money that we're going to have to forego? 100%. It's never going to change. And you know what? If I learned anything in my 7 years on council, it's that things never get cheaper as we go on. They never do. Environmental remediation, environmental standards, all those things, construction, they all get more expensive. So we have an opportunity before us to actually make something of this site, to work with the developer, to provide some relief where we can, and turn this into a functional site that provides a net benefit to the city of Kingston over time. Now that's the key caveat here, is it will be over time. It's not necessarily right away, but we also have to look at the other option, which is to just leave it as it is. And the developer sells it, moves on, and somebody else comes in, looks at it and goes, oh, lots of challenges there, never mind. And as time goes on, this will become harder and harder and harder to actually do anything with. Years from now, when many of us are no longer on council, people will look back at this opportunity and go, what if the council of that term, 2018 to 2022, had actually taken that opportunity and actually built something on this? What would we have now? And so I look at this as an opportunity. Are there challenges? 100%. Are we at the stepping stone of this? 100%. We're just laying the foundation for what can possibly occur there. But if we don't take this necessary step, years from now, people will look back on a vacant land full of contamination and go, why didn't that council take that step that day? So I look at this and I realize that I'm going to support it. And the reason is because I want to be able to tell my kids and my grandkids years from now, when they go through that area, that we took the necessary step to actually see that remediated, because the contamination is not going anywhere unless we actually have the courage to do something about it. And that is going to happen in conjunction with a developer, whether we like it or not, because we're not going to take this on our own. And we're not going to have another opportunity like this before us, probably for at least another 8 to 10 years, at least. So it won't likely be most of us dealing with it. So I'm going to support this, with the caveat that I recognize there are numerous challenges and we are foregoing a lot of tax dollars to do this, but with the understanding that we are doing that with a purpose of getting a better product in the end and a functional space that is currently not usable. And that's all I have to say about that. So thank you. And I hope that the majority of council supports this so that we can build on this opportunity before us. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Hill.
Thank you. And I agree with almost everything that Councillor Bohm said, except for the one comment there that we were foregoing a lot of tax money, because, and I know his point was that we're not foregoing any tax money because there's nothing on this property. To Councillor Hutchison's point, there was one big number that he wasn't including in his calculation. That's the $65 million to remediate this property. So here we have an opportunity to remediate the property, to build a significant amount of additional housing in the community, to remediate that area hopefully on the way to some real reinvigoration of that community, that neighborhood. We're not forking over any money to this developer until the developer meets the standards that we've established, until until we agree on the cost of the remediation and all those sorts of things. And I do agree that we have to be careful and we have to take this step by step and make sure that all the correct processes are being followed. But the reality here is that we have, as Councillor Bohm said, we have a unique opportunity. We're not gathering any tax money on this land. If we don't approve this project, we will never gather any tax money on this land. But we will have to remediate that. I think that will be an expectation of our community, because this is something that has to be addressed, and we heard already about the potential for it to damage the inner harbor, or continue to damage the inner harbor. So this is an absolute, in my mind, this is a no-brainer. This is something that really addresses a whole bunch of our target goals for the community: increased housing, hopefully more affordable housing, addressing the brownfield issues, and at no cost at the end of the day, really, to the taxpayer, because if we don't build this, if we don't approve this, nothing's going in on that property, and we will never realize any tax revenue from that property. So I wholeheartedly support this. I think this is the way to go. I think this is going to be a good example for how we can address some of the other areas that are in need of remediation. So it's a big project. I understand that, but I absolutely support it and I endorse it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and through you. Councillor Hill essentially said exactly what I was about to say, but I wanted to ask it in the form of a question to staff, which is the $65 million price tag on remediation something the city would have to pay if we chose to take it on ourselves? Just to put that on record.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you, Councillor Kiley. So in the event that the city would want to remediate the property, yes, the short answer would be yes. There are some borrowing costs within the 63 million, but and the city might have a slightly better rate if it was borrowing money. But in the end, the actual cost of the remediation has been prepared by professional engineers and reviewed by a third party. So I would expect the cost to be the same no matter who is doing the work. And ultimately, at the end, whatever the tally is will be fully reviewed and audited before any payments are made. So only actual costs would be rebated back out of the taxes.
Excellent. Okay, so as I said, Councillor Hill has made my points. One more question though, just to be sure, because this is proposed to be a 4-phase project, what happens in terms of the tax revenue and in terms of the environmental remediation if we get to phase 3? Maybe I shouldn't say we here. If the developer, the proponent gets to phase 3, should this be passed, and then the project stalls? Can you talk economically and environmentally about that, Mr. Egan-Boss?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Councillor Kiley, and through you, Mr. Mayor. And I do have other staff on the call. I wanted to try to get the answers in because it's so uncertain with this weather. But Paul McClatchy has joined us, so he might add to my answer. But Councillor Kiley, the thing about the brownfields program with the City of Kingston's community improvement plan is the risk is all on the developer. All the costs are front-ended. And all the risks to clean up and to achieve all the approvals through the province and through the record of site condition, and then building permits, all the construction, and then paying taxes. And only after all that is done do the rebates start to go back to the developer. And if more work is done than the maximum allowable, then that's the risk on the developer. The maximum allowable is this amount. And also, if the full development doesn't get done, only the developments that do get done and the taxes get paid on those are the ones that would be rebated. So I don't know if Paul wants to add any more, but I think that addresses your question, Councillor Kiley.
Perhaps Mayor Patterson, through Mr. McClatchy, could, because I'm also thinking ecologically, if a quarter of this site remains unremediated, does that have potential implications for the harbor, as we've talked about earlier, or the rest of the land?
Archie?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. It does have an impact to the entire ecosystem of the inner harbor, I suppose. But the way land is remediated in Ontario is it's done parcel by parcel. So a successful cleanup on phase 1 results in a record of site condition for phase 1, and so on for phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4. If the developer gets successfully through phase 1, 2, and 3, but then let's say phase 4 is unsuccessful, we have another orphaned contaminated property problem, albeit a much smaller one.
Thank you. And that anticipates my next and final question, which is, at that point, if that were to happen, it is reasonable to suggest that it would be much lesser cost for the city to remediate that portion of the property than saying we're going to do nothing. I guess this is what Councillor Bowen was saying. We're going to do nothing now and just let it sit. So even if that eventuality happens, which hopefully it will not, it means a much less price tag for us down the road. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, that is correct. It'll reduce the entire liability to whoever it falls upon in the future.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I'm happy to support this.
Okay, thanks. Next is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just wondering, well, first of all, I agree with Councillor Hill and Councillor Kiley and recognize the benefit for our community with this project. But I wonder now, in light of the Inner Harbor remediation project perhaps moving forward, it's certainly something that we're looking at. Does staff know if the developer connected with Transportation Canada at all? Have there been any conversations?
I feel that through you, Mr. Mayor. The tannery property is adjacent to the proposed Inner Harbor remediation area, so therefore they become a stakeholder. I do understand through conversation with Transport Canada and with the tannery owner that they have discussed the connection between the two projects. I haven't been privy to that discussion, but I do know those discussions have happened.
And also the remediation, the actual processes for the remediation. Will it include a third-party review? Like how vigilant is city staff with this process? If this is going to cost us in a roundabout way, although the developer is paying for it, what are we doing to make sure that it is done properly, I guess?
So through you, Mr. Mayor, we manage I'm going to call it the due diligence aspect of our brownfield projects the same way for every project. Our definition of a successful cleanup is the acquisition of a record of site condition from the province of Ontario. It'll be the same for the tannery site, the various phases of the tannery site. So that third-party review that you're talking about with the tannery site is the province of Ontario, is the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Especially since with the tannery, they do a hybrid they're planning to do a hybrid remediation approach, which not only removes the very contaminated soil, but provides a lot of risk assessment and risk management measures for the less contaminated soil. So anytime you do that, what they call a tier 3 risk assessment process, automatically triggers a full review by the Standards and Development Branch of the Ministry of Environment and Conservation and Parks. So that'll be reviewed through them, and a record of site condition does not get issued until they're satisfied with the review. And their review, I can tell you from personal experience, is not trivial.
Thank you very much.
Okay, is there anybody else that wishes to speak that has not already spoken? Okay, so we will call the vote then on clause number 6. All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, and that carries by a vote of 7-2. Councillor Hutchison and Councillor Holland opposed. Oh, Councillor Stroud, are you on the line? Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so we'll continue. Okay, moving on then to clause number 7, capital project status report.
Your Worship. Oh, Your Worship, it's Lisa Osanek. I'm sorry, I've never used the phone for Zoom before. Our power's out. My internet is stuck. I didn't know how to unmute using the phone. I want to record myself as a no for that vote, please.
Thank you. Councillor Sanik, it was, we thought you were Councillor Stroud, so it's good to know you're there. So yes, so you've been counted opposed, Councillor Hutchison, Councillor Holland, and Councillor Osanek. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on then to clause 7, capital project status report as of May 31st, 2021. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, on to report number 66 from Heritage Kingston.
Moved by Councillor Doherty, I'm just making sure everybody's here when I have the movers and the seconders. Yes, and Councillor Kiley, that report number 66 from Heritage Kingston be received and adopted.
Okay. Councillor Bohm, you wanted to separate the first item?
Yes, Your Worship, and through you, it's actually, I'm not even 100% sure how to do this. With the first item, I'd like to separate it, but it's just specifically item 8 on it that I'd like separated out of the vote.
So I think what I'll propose, which our usual practice, is that if that's the only item that's being separated on the report, we'll first vote on the balance of the report. So that would be everything from report number 66, except for clause 1, subsection 1, which is the approval for application of Ontario Heritage Act approval 1403 Highway 15. Okay, so first we'll vote on everything except for that. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, so now on clause 1, subsection 1, Councillor Bohm has asked for a separation of paragraph 8 under the clause. So paragraph 8 is the applicant shall substitute a heritage appropriate cladding for the proposed final cladding. So first we'll do a vote on everything except for paragraph 8. So that's paragraphs 1 through 7. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Now on paragraph 8, we will call the vote. All those in favor? A point of order, Councillor Kiley.
I had a question if I could. I'm just hoping to get some context from staff because truth be told, I didn't realize this was an issue until this evening at the delegation. So why did staff recommend what they did and what's the context around the committee altering that decision?
Who from staff is able to address that? Commissioner Hugo-Boss.
Oh, so I was not there and I am not part of planning. I do know that Commissioner Agnew has not been able to get back on. And I know also Director Campbell has not been back on. So I'm hoping somebody else. Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
What I'll do, I think, Councillor Doherty, I noticed you put your hand up and I know that you're on the committee. So perhaps Councillor Doherty, we go to you for context there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The context around this is, first of all, the Heritage Committee has never approved vinyl siding before. We had major discussion around this topic, including that all siding, there have been improvements in all types of siding, including vinyl siding. However, Heritage has never approved vinyl siding before, which is why it's important that in clause 8, it actually states that it would be substituted with heritage appropriate cladding. So it doesn't specify wood or any particulars cladding or siding, but that it asks for the siding still to be heritage appropriate because it is next to a heritage property. And this is why it went through Heritage Committee in the first place. There was a lot of discussion around that.
Yeah, thank you. As a follow-up, that's what I was also trying to get my head around. This is not a heritage building. It's just because it's in proximity. And if that's the case, is that normal? Like, I've never been on Heritage Committee, so excuse my ignorance, but is that something that committee even has purview over?
Ms. Campbell.
Thank you. I'm not sure if everyone can hear me. I'm actually
So, Ms. Campbell, it's a valiant effort. We can hear you, but it's extreme slow motion and probably a little bit difficult to do. It's being said. Councillor Doherty, is there any insight that you want to provide, or is there anyone else from staff that wants to provide insight?
Through my phone.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
If I could step in, I was able to reach Commissioner Agnew on the phone. So I think I can just give a little background. Again, I did not attend the meeting. I just want to give a little background on why, I think an answer to the question as to why staff didn't add 8 as their own. I think 8 was added by the committee. That it's an outbuilding that is not attached to the heritage building. It is in a rural area of new construction. This is a new construction. A heritage appropriate cladding would be a nice to have, but it is not essential. It is not required in any policy, is what I understood from a quick discussion I had with Ms. Agnew while I was trying to listen to Councillor Doherty in the other ear. But I believe those, just to answer that question, I believe those are true statements of why staff had made the recommendation they did.
Councillor Riley?
Thanks. I think that's all I need to know. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bohm, I saw you next.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I just wanted to provide a little bit more comment based on what I heard from the residents. And essentially it was that ultimately they want to do what's right here to maintain the heritage aspect of the property. However, the ambiguity that exists within the heritage recommendation of number 8 was they sought clarification and nobody was really able to give it. There seemed to be this large debate on, what was allowed, what wasn't allowed, and it just seemed to put them in an untenable situation of not really knowing what they could actually do. And after seeking further clarification, they were unable to actually understand what they were actually allowed to use on an outbuilding. So they obviously, you saw the delegation this evening, they obviously want to do what's right for that heritage property. But at the same time, from up to 20 meters away, I would challenge anyone to decipher the difference between wood batten and vinyl batten. And it's almost essentially like we're asking them to spend 3 times the amount of money, and short of somebody trespassing on the property, they're not really going to be able to actually understand the difference between it. And vinyl is, more impervious to rot. It's more impervious to any type of insect or bug infestation. So, we're in a sense saying, be more heritage, but at the same time, spend more money. And my challenge there is that if they spend that money, they're going to have less money to actually spend on the heritage property, which is their actual abode, it's their actual home. So I just feel like it's a recommendation that has the best of intentions, but it might be slightly misplaced in this instance. And with that in mind, I'm going to vote against it in recognition of the residents wanting to do the right thing, but being given a stipulation that wasn't fully explored, and them not really being able to get clarification from the Heritage Committee as to what it actually means. And it may very well mean, a year from now, the Heritage Committee may come back and say, oh yeah, well, we've explored it and we'll totally allow that. But that would leave the residents that I represent sort of already out to lunch. So, in that instance, I would ask council in this instance, it seems staff also were sort of not really sure on this. So with that being said, I would ask council to sort of keep clauses 1 to 7, which we've already done, and vote against clause 8 with the recognition that the residents do really want to do the right thing, but they also want to be able to afford to spend money on the actual heritage property, which is their home. It's not this outbuilding, to be sure. And one of the main facets that I've always held dear in my heart is that non-heritage buildings should not attempt to replicate heritage buildings. So I think that they need to be there to reflect them and to, basically elevate them, but not try to be them. So, keep that in mind when you vote tonight. I would ask people to recognize the fact that from the road, nobody's going to know any difference. But if it's 3 times to 4 times the cost and more, I guess more susceptible to rot and insect infestation, then what are we really asking of the residents in this? So that's all I have to say on that. And I hope council will support my residents and myself in voting against this and recognizing that you want to do the right thing here. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will call the vote then on paragraph 8 of clause 1, subsection 1. All those in favor? Opposed? And that loses by a vote of 4 to 5. So Councillor, sorry, can we do the vote one more time? Because I'm used to announcing who's in the minority. So we just do that one more time. All those in favor? Okay, so Councillor Doherty, Deputy Mayor Neal, Councillor McLaren, and Councillor Holland in the minority on that. Okay, very good. So that's everything with report number 66. Report number 67 from the Arts, Recreation, and Community Policies Committee.
Moved by Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor Holland, that report 67 from Arts, Recreation, and Community Policies Committee be received and adopted.
Okay, so there are two clauses. The first is the report received from the Arts Advisory Committee with appointments to the Art and Public Places Working Group and the appointments to the Mayor's Arts Awards Working Group. The second is a report received from the Housing and Homelessness Advisory Committee with the Housing and Homelessness Advisory Committee 2020 report card and appointments to the Housing and Homelessness Review Working Group. Okay, we will call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, report number 68 from the Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Policies Committee.
Moved by Councillor Neal, Deputy Mayor Neal, seconded by Councillor Doherty, that report number 68 from the Environment, Infrastructure, and Transportation Policies Committee be received and adopted.
Just the one clause, traffic calming policy and guidelines. Councillor Doherty.
I want to just make a comment and then ask a question. The first comment is I want to thank staff for all the hard work that's gone into this study and the report in front of us. It's very detailed. It really gives council a clear understanding of all the options in front of us. The question, though, is that in our EITP meeting, we did discuss the need for consultation with the community, including schools, before the introduction of any bollards and any traffic calming measures. So I wonder if, and I didn't see that in the report, so I wonder if staff could speak to them.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you. I'm joined also tonight by Matt Hudson, the manager of Transportation Policy and Programs, who worked extensively on this. So to answer your question, Councillor Doherty, I think the consultation aspects of any work that we do in transportation, we want to make sure that residents, stakeholders, anyone who has an interest in the work that's being done, has that information, access to the information, and the ability to answer questions. So certainly the way sharing information about what is planned as part of any traffic calming implementation would be part of what is done under this program. So that would include sharing information with residents in the areas, but also reaching out to stakeholders, school groups, schools, and others that may be interested.
And so that sharing information and reaching out to them, will that happen before the introduction of bollards, for example?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yes. So the intent is that information would all be shared ahead of time, and then certainly once the implementation is also completed, that staff are available to answer questions and address any concerns that arise from anyone who has anything that they would like to speak on.
Great, thanks.
Okay, next is Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you. I just want to thank staff for the comprehensive approach they've taken to this. This is something that I know in my district in particular, I mean, obviously things in my district probably more than any other councillors, but in my district in particular, this has been something that's been somewhat of a challenge. And I did have some concerns initially with the one road that's picked by councillors. And my concerns revolved around the fact that, are we picking winners and losers? And we get so much information and so many different requests. And then I thought about it after speaking with, Commissioner Kidd and realizing the fact that that we're talking about a lot of roads over eternity. And also the fact that there's essentially other aspects to this, and the fact that there's community engagement, there's school zones being looked at. I know in speaking with Director Semple that they're always taking community feedback into account. So with that being said, I'm not as concerned about that one sort of road being picked. I guess in this case, it's kind of you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So in this case, what it is councillors will get their sort of one street to recommend based on community feedback, but there's also many other mechanisms for the community to play into this. And I think that's the most important takeaway from this, is that with this policy, it's really community driven. And as councillors, we know that, we get so many complaints, and really it needs to be driven from the community, because if we're going to take anecdotal reports, it needs to be based on numbers. It needs to be based on staff feedback. It needs to be based on experience. And we are only just one counselor for, each district, and of course the mayor at the end of the day. So it's not really up to us to pick winners and losers at the end of the day. It's up to us to take the most complained about street at the end of the day and forward it to staff for further evaluation and evidence-based decision making. So with that being said, in talking with some staff members, I actually have something which I won't propose at this council meeting, but it will be something that will come as a notice of motion. And part of it is based on the community's request over here for additional speed feedback signs, and the fact that they really feel that they do make a difference, because oftentimes people get in a rush and they don't actually realize how fast they're actually going. So if this is something that passes, then I will move this motion with the mayor as a seconder at the next council meeting in August. And whereas if council approved the traffic calming policy and guidelines at its meeting held on July 13, 2021, and whereas further support the proposed traffic calming policy would be beneficial to the entire community, therefore be it resolved that staff be directed to incorporate funds into the 2022 budget submission to purchase 5 additional driver feedback signs to respond to speeding concerns in school zones and neighborhoods. So this is feedback I've heard directly from constituents, and it's a request directly from residents, and that they do feel those signs make a difference. And what this does is just adds a little bit more money to actually allow additional signs to be put in place to allow the community to actually see that their complaints and their recommendations do actually result in real world change at the end of the day. Now, of course, obviously, once those signs have been there for 2 years, they do need to be moved. As people do become kind of numb or immune to them over time. But this will give us more signs to place around the city to actually make people more cognizant and aware of the speed that they're going in certain areas, and allow us to buy time to actually adapt true holistic traffic calming policies, which are not just an ad hoc approach. They are a true sort of strategic approach to traffic calming and better road designs going forward. So I would ask council to support this at the August meeting, and I would also ask council to support this traffic policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of other speakers on my list. It is 10:41. It looks as though this is the last substantive piece on our agenda. So given that, we'll ask for a motion to extend the meeting to finish the agenda. Moved by Councillor Doherty, seconded by Councillor Hill. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, so next on my list is Councillor Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess I'm not opposed to what Councillor Bone said, but I understand what he's doing. I presume that's not reconsideration, though, for whatever reason.
So no, that's a standard motion that has to deal with budget, not the policy that's in front of us.
So my concern is, well, I'm glad to see Mr. Coulson here. I just learned about a week ago about concerns about the safety measures using bollards at the corner of Barry and Johnson, which is right on the edge of my district. And I think people didn't know who to complain to. So I'm just wondering, that was done apparently without consultation. So my first question is, under the policy, would the and I'm following up on Councillor Doherty here. Under the policy, would normally that be, such a move be done after consultation with the school, immediate public, etc.?
Mr. Sutton.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your question, Councillor Hutchison. So I think if there are a variety of different aspects of the traffic calming program, but if it was one of the district councillor selected interventions for traffic calming, the intent would be that that street is selected and we would share information about the implementation that was forthcoming. So we would share it with residents and stakeholders in schools, as I outlined in Councillor Doherty's question. Share that information, share what was coming forward. And then once that implementation was complete, also be available to answer any concerns or questions that come up. The types of measures that are implemented, particularly the type 1 measures that are spoken about in the report, are measures that are easily implemented. They're also easily adjusted, and allow for adjustments to be made if there are safety concerns that arise. With that said, any of the installations or that are put in place are designed, of course, with safety in mind, and are designed with professional engineers and traffic safety experts that put that in place. The other piece that I would say, though, is we see these installations and the installation that occurs not as the finality or the end of the conversation. This is part of the initial way in which we can address, some of the systemic issues that may be in place on that roadway or in that neighborhood. So the intent is to install measures install measures and impact motorist behavior and slow motorists down, and then continue that conversation with the community about how that's working.
Okay. I thought perhaps that staff had moved with some clarity to put this traffic altering action in place with the bullers because they thought it was a safety issue, and sort of like act safely now, discuss it later. Does that fit in with what you just said?
Through you, Your Worship. So I think specific to the installation that happened on Johnson Street and Barry, so that installation that was completed, it is not an example of what would be a traffic calming measure that would be selected by a councillor to be put in place. So for a variety of reasons, but that's an arterial roadway. There were safety issues that were present at that location that these types of tools that are outlined in the guidelines are useful in helping to address. So the specific issue at Barry and Johnson Street is an issue that was related to the school, the way in which pickup, drop off, and other vehicles were moving in and around the school, and the way in which that was impacting crossings at that location. So these types of tools that were put in place at Barry and Johnson are examples of the way that we can use some of the tools that are outlined in the traffic calming guidelines to address safety concerns that come up. It's not an example of the district councillor selected process, but it speaks to those ways in which we would address transportation issues overall.
Okay, thank you. And I'm pursuing this because it's affected 3 councillors. Okay, and Councillor Stroud, Councillor Doherty, and myself. Okay, and the biggest concern is that it was done without public consultation. And I thought maybe there was a reason for that, and maybe there is, but so that's why I was interested in knowing if it was following the policy. And you gave me a description of the policy, but in this specific case, was the policy followed?
Through you, Your Worship. So in this particular instance at Barry and Johnson, so information was shared to residents in the area. There were leaflets and other information provided both in hard copy and online. The information was shared with the school board, and information as part of the installation was shared with the school directly.
What I took from what you said was that we will, that the department's willing to follow up on this should it need to, or if they're requested by a group of residents. Is that correct?
Through Your Worship, yes, yes, for sure. So the intent is that as any individual concern comes up with any type of traffic calming installation or any aspect of, I think in the transportation network, staff follow up on that to ensure that there isn't a safety concern that's been created or exacerbated. And then we work with the resident or the stakeholder to provide, information, hear their concerns, and make adjustments as necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next is Councillor Hill.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. I'm really pleased by this. I think this is a great tool for us. I mean, I've always been opposed to the notion of kind of management by motion, and that we would be kind of debating, which district is going to get a 4-way stop and which one isn't. I think this gives us some tools as councillors. Obviously, we'd like more tools, but at the same time, what it also does is it gives us a guide that we can share with our constituents, because there are so many questions that come from our constituents about how do we arrive at these decisions. And I think that this document really kind of outlines that. It really helps to, I think, underline, the fact that there are competing demands across the whole city for this kind of intervention, and I think it establishes a level playing field and certainly some fairness to the whole process. So I think it's a really timely document, and I think it's going to be a great tool for us as councillors, both in terms of exercising some tools that we might have at our disposal, but even more importantly, having a document that will really help us to explain the process to residents. So I really want to congratulate staff on their good work on this. Thank you.
Okay, I don't have any other speakers on my list for this item. Oh, Councillor Carl, go ahead.
Sorry, Mayor Patterson, I forgot to put up my hand. I was just wondering if staff could comment on how this policy, which, as Councillor Hill says, is very helpful in articulating and communicating with residents, but how does it fit with larger issues like red light cameras or automated speed enforcement? What's the relationship between these traffic calming measures specifically and greater calming across the city with the 2 other policies that I've mentioned?
Through you, Your Worship, and thank you for your question, Councillor Kiley. One of the main goals in updating the traffic calming policy and guidelines that are before council tonight was also in setting the right expectations about what traffic calming is and what it can do. So part of our review, in completing our review, one of the themes that kept coming up was that the traffic calming program had become where many issues, some of which are not best addressed by traffic calming, were ending up. So it's really about framing setting the right expectations about what traffic calming can do, and also about what it can't do. And there are many other things that need to that play into the city's transportation network that build off of what traffic calming can help with at the neighborhood level and on our local roadways. So enforcement programs like the forthcoming red light camera program, automated speed enforcement or photo radar aspects that may augment and support the traffic calming that's in place in the neighborhoods, but also that we are using the tools to understand how a roadway could be redesigned when it's due for reconstruction, or whether there's an opportunity as part of an additional capital project in the area to make those changes, make additional changes or make those changes permanent. So traffic calming is intended to address an issue that exists in a neighborhood. It's intended to slow vehicles down, to slow motorists down. And that aspect of it, and the guidelines outline, 27 or more tools that would be available to try and address that behavior. But other transportation issues, other transportation safety concerns that arise aren't necessarily covered by traffic calming. They would be covered by our overall transportation issue process. A summary of which is included in the report in figure 1 in the EIT report, and that's how we would approach those pieces.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks very much.
Okay, so with that, we will call the vote then on clause 1. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, report number 69 from the Rural Advisory Committee.
Moved by Councillor Baum, seconded by Councillor Hill, that report 69 from the Rural Advisory Committee be received and adopted.
Rural Advisory 2020 report card. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, on to report number 70 from Planning Committee.
Moved by Deputy Mayor Neal, seconded by Councillor Kiley, that report number 70 from the Planning Committee be received and adopted.
So there is the one item, approval of application for zoning bylaw amendment 484 Albert Street and 620 Princess Street. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, moving on, we have nothing from Committee of the Whole. Information reports, tender and contract awards subject to the established criteria for delegation of authority for the month of May 2021. Okay, seeing no questions there. We have no information reports from members of council. Miscellaneous business, we do have one motion moved by Councillor Neal, seconded by Councillor Holland, that the resignation of Matthew Porter from the Municipal Accessibility Advisory Committee be received with regret. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. We have no new motions. We had one notice of motion from Councillor Baum. Are there any other notices of motion? Okay, seeing none. Madam Deputy Clerk, ask for minutes, please.
Moved by Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor McLaren, that the minutes of Special City Council meeting number 16-2021 held Wednesday, June 16th, 2021, and City Council meeting number 15-2021 held Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021 be confirmed.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. We have some tabling of documents, number of communications. Is there any other business? Madam Deputy Clerk, ask for bylaws, please.
Moved by Councillor McLaren, seconded by Councillor Hutchison, that bylaws 1 through 8, 20 through 23, and 19 be given their first and second reading.
Opposed? And that's carried.
Moved by Councillor McLaren, seconded by Councillor Hutchison, that clause 12.63 of bylaw number 2021-41 be suspended for the purpose of giving bylaws 3 to 5 3 readings.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried.
And moved by Councillor McLaren and seconded by Councillor Hutchison that bylaws 3 through 18, 20 through 24, and 19 be given their third reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Motion to adjourn, please. Moved by Councillor McLaren, seconded by Councillor Hill. All those in favor? Opposed? And we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.